Today I'm joined by legendary bow hunter John Eberhart out of Michigan, a man who has spent over 6 decades hunting exclusively public and permission ground. With 59 record book bucks, 57 by bow, and 2 with a muzzleloader, John has built a reputation for doing what most hunters think is impossible: consistently killing mature deer without private land, leases, bait, or any shortcuts. The beginning of this podcast had a mild technical issue, so I cut that section out, and I'll cut you guys in where I asked John what separates him from other hunters. And before we start, John did not ask me to say this, but I genuinely like to recommend that you guys check out his new series of books, Ultimate Guide to DIY Bucks. There are 3 total volumes, and he put a tremendous amount of time and real-world experience into these. The books were co-authored with Greg Godfrey from Tethered, and together they've created an incredibly detailed breakdown of how to understand deer behavior and master their combined 92 seasons of proven hunting tactics, techniques, and strategies, to the point that no matter your weapon of choice, where in the country you hunt, or the type of terrain you hunt, you are a serious threat to taking the best bucks your area has to offer. So without further ado, let's get into the podcast. And then you get entered into it. So you're one of the 30, you're one of the 40 hunters that are going into that situation. What are you doing to be able to get those bucks that are sitting behind you killed in a setting where there's so many people being shoved into this one area? And how are you going in and piecing out where exactly that mature buck is going to be located? The one that has for some reason lived beyond 3 years old in this setting where there's so many hunters congregated into one area. What makes you different beyond those 30 to 40 people that allows you to position yourself right on top of them?
Nothing, because it's very rare that I kill a buck in the first 2 days of season in those types of scenarios. Obviously, what I do differently than most hunters is I do all of my scouting and location preparation during postseason. And on public land, you can't prepare anything, but you can prep it as best as you know how at the time. And that way, when you go back to hunt it, it's somewhat ready. You've been up the tree already. You know exactly where you need to put your sticks and where you need to put your steps or whatever. Because I always do that during postseason scouting. And but when you're hunting public land, typically by the first few days of season, most of the mature bucks that are 3.5 years old or older, which is very few on public lands here, they're already nocturnal. I mean, they're already been from all the other hunters doing all their preseason scouting, preseason location preparation, just intruding into the area after those deer have been left alone for the last 7 or 8 months. Those mature bucks know what that influx of human activity means. It's danger. That's a threat to their existence. So now they leave, and they're not bedded in the tall ferns. They're not bedded in the weed fields. They're not bedded in the peripheral edges of places. They're pushed just from preseason scouting and location preparation from all the other hunters. They're pushed back into the interiors of the bedding areas. And yeah, they may move during daylight hours a little bit. Once they're in those secure bedding areas, they might move a little bit during daylight. But to give you an example, I've been hunting 60 seasons. This will be my 61st season coming up, bow season. And in the first 4 days of seasons in Michigan, because I always hunt the first 3 or 4 days, I've only taken 5 book bucks. I've taken 59 book bucks total with my bow, but I've only taken 5 during those first 3 or 4 days. And those were in bedding areas, and they were rattled in. They were sparred in, not rattled, sparred.
So in that setting, the reason you're not killing bucks at a high frequency due to the high pressure is because the deer are being pressured so hard those first few days that they actually become nocturnal to that point. Which nocturnal is kind of a phrase that I think needs defined a little bit more beyond just saying nocturnal, because a lot of guys, they piece it to, well, they purely move at nighttime. And I think that there's very few situations where bucks are actually moving purely at nighttime. And that might be one of the settings, though, where if you have a 1 square mile and you introduce 30, 40 hunters, where maybe you're having a lack of success on those days because those bucks are truly hunkering down all day long until nighttime, until the human activity starts to dwindle back out. And then in return, you can slip in and you can get a better hand on it. Is that kind of what you're
Well,
thinking?
you said so much pressure during the first few days. No, the pressure The pressure that's made them somewhat nocturnal outside the interiors of their bedding areas during daylight hours, that pressure has been put on them probably since mid-August. Okay, we've got an October 1 opener. So usually around early August to mid-August, that's when the majority of hunters in that area start doing their scouting and location preparation and marking entry and exit routes. And, that's the, a deer, when you're scouting, that deer doesn't know you're not trying to kill him. You are a personal threat to his existence. They don't know you don't have a gun or a bow. They don't look and say, "Oh, he doesn't have a bow. I can sit here and stand here in the ferns and let him walk by." You know, your that large human influx of activity during August and September, when everybody's doing all that preseason stuff, that turns those bucks. That makes them go into their bedding areas, and they typically don't move much beyond the interiors of their dense bedding areas during daylight hours. And all of the 5 book bucks that I've shot during those first 3 or 4 days of season were in interiors of bedding areas or along the edge of a standing cornfield, which is a bedding area. So in interiors of bedding areas, because they're in there before daylight, you know, well before season, they're transitioning into the bedding areas before daylight. And then once they're in there, they may get up and move because they've been in there since before daylight, and they haven't heard. If they haven't heard anything other than other deer, you can tell the difference. They can tell the difference between a human walking and a deer walking. Then they feel a little more comfortable getting up and moving short distances during daylight hours. But they're not gonna. They're rarely gonna move outside of the bedding areas into exposed areas where they're vulnerable during daylight hours. So the and all of the bucks I've shot, I shouldn't say all except one of those 5, I sparred in with a sparring sequence. Just a social sparring sequence, not a rattle sequence.
As we roll into shed and turkey season, knowing exactly what land you're on is essential. Property boundaries, landowner names, the ability to save custom pins, and one of my favorite features during this time of year is the tracker. I use this feature to see exactly where I walked across the terrain, how I accessed a ridge, how I slipped through a bedding area, and how deer sign lines up with my actual movement. Oftentimes, my approach to these areas is very similar to how deer utilize the same exact terrain. So whether I'm scouting for sign on a new piece of land, double checking a property line before crossing a fence, or marking an old dead head that I just found, Onyx Hunt is the tool I rely on every single time. And if you're interested, please use my code WR, stands for Whitetail Research, for 20% off at onyxmaps.com, or just scan this QR code, or go to the link in the description. Thanks, guys. Yeah, no, it's really well explained, because I feel like I struggle sometimes to explain what I mean whenever I talk about a nocturnal buck to people, and uh, because from a research perspective, oftentimes I'll say that there's no such thing as a nocturnal buck. There might be the very few nuanced situations where there's just so much ridiculous human presence in an area that it can cause deer to be strictly nocturnal. And I think that it's very rare, though. In most settings, what's happening is exactly what you stated. And it's really cool to be able to observe from my perspective with the drone, and then also just hear that that's kind of what you've pieced together throughout your 60 years, is that they are making small moves back inside of bedding very consistently. They're standing up and they're cleaning themselves, or they're moving over and they're just kind of making a couple of rubs. And that's why a lot of times in these bedding areas you'll find cluster rubs, because they're bored back in that location and they stand up and move around and make rubs, or they'll move over to the edges of it and make a scrape. And then in some situations you'll be in during the rut, and a lot of people will be hunting in that situation, and a lot of the rutting activity takes place back in the beds, which I know is something that you've mentioned that you've seen before as well. Is that primarily in most cases for you, most of the rutting activity is taking place in the beds, correct?
Yeah, most of the actual breeding takes place in the bedding areas. So um, typically, I hunt typically early season if I'm on private land, free permission private lands, where there's much less pressure. The section may have pressure, but the piece of property I'm on does not have a lot of pressure, maybe. Um, then I'll hunt food locations. But the food locations have to have perimeter security cover around them, and they have to have adequate security cover, transition security cover to a known bedding area for them to be at a food location or at a scrape area during daylight hours. So, in other words, if there's a bedding area and let's say 200 yards away from it, there's an apple tree, but the buck has to, if he in the morning wants to eat apples at this apple tree on his way back to bed, he's not going to come in there and eat apples and then wait until daylight and then transition through, let's say, 200 yards of open, vulnerable timber where he could get shot. You know, it's daylight. It's crack daylight enough for somebody to shoot. He's not going to make that transition through open timber to the bedding area. In other words, okay, he's only going to be feeding at that feeding location or working that scrape area if he has adequate security transition cover to that bedding area, whether he's there in the morning and transitioning back in the morning or transitioning out of the bedding area to feed at that before dark. He's got to have the adequate security cover to transition through to get to it, and he has to have the adequate perimeter security cover around it to feel safe eating there, where he's got a quick exit route. When I've hunted bucks and sparred them in, one thing I've noticed is bucks in bedding areas, you know, they typically are moving into the bedding areas 40 minutes before daylight, half hour to 40 minutes before daylight. And then once they're in there, they'll bed down. And I do a lot of all day sets. And they may get up and, you know, like you said, go to the bathroom, urine, stuff a couple feet away and poop and, you know, put their droppings down or make rubs. A lot of times you'll find a buck bed and it's got 3 or 4 rubs around it. And a lot of times they will also get up and turn according to the wind direction if the wind changes. That's really prevalent in hill country where they tend to bed up on tops of hills.
Have you seen? I had a different question, but now that you mentioned the wind shifting, have you seen deer actually making complete moves off of the wind shifting? Not just flipping their bed around like the direction they're facing, but have you seen them stand up and completely relocate in the middle of a day, in the middle of the day, due to a wind shift?
In hill country in Ohio, I did one time. In Michigan, where I hunt in Michigan, it's pretty flat, and bedding areas are all swamps and marshes and cattails and stuff like that. Um, but when you're in hill country, where mature bucks will tend to bed on the crest of a hill where he can maybe see down one side and catch the wind of anything coming from the other side. If the wind changes, yeah, they'll get up and move, and maybe if the wind changes 180 degrees, they'll get up and totally flip their bed where they're bedding on the other side where they got the visual and the wind's coming up now from the other side. But I've only seen that one time, and that was in hill country.
It's something that I've talked about a lot in some of my past research. It was one of my larger focuses in the first year was wind shifts and analyzing almost always for what it's worth. A deer will do something with a wind shift. If it's a large wind shift from, say a 4 mile per hour south wind to a 10 north, they will stand up in their bed or flip, or they'll move across the drainage to the opposing side. And then there's some situations where I've seen them move a half mile to a mile in the middle of the day, completely relocating their bedding area. But oftentimes the the route that they're taking is borderline unhuntable unless you just absolutely knew they were going to be doing something to that nature. It's very difficult to get on them in that situation, or if you had a way to be scentless, which we'll get into that in the future. But one thing that you were talking about earlier, which was raising a thought in my brain, was um, talking about how the habitat has to allow for this to be able to take place with them transitioning bedding areas. And one thing that I've seen is a heavy amount of deer activity taking place next to human presence. And that doesn't mean hunting presence or anything, just general human activity. There's a house here, there's a parking lot here, there's people pulling in and walking to a trailhead over here. There's just general, maybe a road in general is driving by, or a dirt road or something of that nature. Deer activity seems to really kind of serves as kind of like like the human pressure serves as kind of like a magnet to deer activity, and it all gravitates and exists nearby that human pressure or just presence in general. And it's something I've been really fascinated by. And the only way that it can take place, to get back to the point, is if the habitat allows for it. And I was wondering if that's something that you've seen a lot in the past with deer kind of gravitating towards that human presence in general, and maybe 50 to 150 yards off of a parking lot, or nearby housing, or these areas where people often easily overlook. And the habitat allows for it though, and nobody ever walks through that area. And therefore a mature buck calls that spot home. And he doesn't have a massive home range because he's kind of created this perfect little area for himself.
Yeah, yeah, that's basically non-threatening human presence. Anytime, like I live in a lake association, and the deer pay zero attention to humans. A lot of state parks and stuff where there's no hunting allowed, they don't pay a lot of attention to humans. I knew a guy in North Dakota killed a monster buck, literally 100 and some yards off the parking lot. He could hear the people in the parking lot talking, but it was in a little cattail marsh right off the edge of the parking lot. Nobody ever stepped foot in it. So all the people that park there on a daily basis during hunting season and preseason scouting and stuff had never been a threat to that buck's existence living in that little cattail marsh. And it had some reason. The guy, I don't know how he knew that buck was there, but he ended up knowing that buck was there, and he went in there, like in the middle of the night and waited, and he came in the morning. The buck came in the morning, and he took that buck. And yeah, anytime, like a lot of times. In fact, I had an email from a guy the other day, and he was in, I think he was hunting in Pennsylvania, and there was a, no, he was actually in Michigan, southern Michigan, and there's a park down by where he lives, and it is open to hunting, but there's a lot of hikers, and there's bike trails on it, and I told him, I said, man, you need to, don't be afraid to hunt that. He didn't want to hunt it because he thought, well, there's people going through there. Well, those people on bikes and walking on those very specific trails, that's all non-threatening to deer that have lived there their whole lives. That's their core area. That's their home. And they know that is non-threatening activity. Now, and they're walking on a cadence or riding a bike on a cadence. And now if you get a hunter walking through there and he's walking slowly and stopping, that's not the normal activity for that particular lane. So that's going to make a deer more aware and spooky. But, that's the type of area where you could easily go and kill a really nice buck and not be afraid to hunt relatively close to that trail if the adequate security cover is there for a good buck to be there. A good friend of mine was hunting in southern Illinois, 16,000 acre piece of public land, and it's by permit only in November. God, I can't think of the name of it right off the top of my head. Pike? No, not Pike. Um, anyway, he had drawn 3 years in a row to do the November bow hunt prior to the Illinois gun season because they also have permitted, a very limited amount of gun hunters that get permits drawn for this 16,000 acre piece. And he never shot anything. He never had a good opportunity at a big buck. But he said, man, every year during the week that I'm there, they kill a couple 170s and maybe 180. They kill 3 or 4 big monster bucks. And I said, well, how many people are there? Well, he said, oh, several hundred people, on 16,000 acres. That's a lot. That's a lot of land. So, you can put a couple hundred hunters on that with no problem. And these are bow hunters, not gun hunters. And I said, well, when you do I'm a percentage guy. When you take, let's say they killed 4 big bucks, and let's say they had 300 bow hunters or 200 bow hunters, that's a 2% success rate on monster bucks. That's a pretty low percentage. I said, it's wide open to hunting. You don't have to have a permit to hunt in December. As soon as December hits and the gun season, as soon as the gun season ends, which is in December, anybody can go in there and hunt with the bow. So I said, why don't you wait until after gun season and wait for a snowfall? Watch your phone, watch your weather reports, and when you get it, you see that they're going to get a decent snowfall if they're going to. A lot of times they don't get it down there. But that very first year, I requested him do that. They got like a 6 inches of snow, and he called the park ranger because those parks always have a Panther Creek is the name of it. Those parks always have park rangers. So he called the park ranger, asked him if they got the snow. They did, because I had done this before. That's why I'm telling him to do this. He went down there. So now he's down there scouting 24 hours, within 24 hours after the snow. So any sign he sees in the snow is fresh. And usually by that time in December, because I think that's around mid-December actually, the bucks are on a bedding to feeding routine. So now all he's got to do, he's found the routes, their transition routes. Now all he's got to do is hope a good buck is traveling it during daylight hours. And he shot a big 8 point his very first sit, and it was 75 yards behind the ranger station, a place where nobody would have thought of hunting in November.
Yeah, that's a pretty cool story. Yeah.
But being that close to that ranger station, it was a non-threatening route for the deer because nobody was hunting there because it was too close to that ranger station.
I had a point to come off of that, which I found really. Oh, that was what I was going to say. I got so invested into your story that I lost track on my train of thought. I
I do
was,
all the time.
because right at the very beginning you had mentioned that there were 4 deer that were killed that year on the across 1,600 acres, and in my opinion, I'd say they killed most of the mature bucks in that area because you
16,000 acres.
oh 16,000 acres. Okay, I
16,000
thought
acres, 1,600.
changes things then.
Yeah,
Yes, I was thinking 1,600 acres. It's like you probably killed over half
yeah,
of the
you're
mature
right.
bucks that were there. Yeah, so it's like, well, I mean, they were pretty lethal at that point. So yeah, over 16,000 acres. Then yeah, they didn't really put much of a dent in the mature bucks.
Yeah,
That's pretty cool.
Panther Creek's a huge, huge public land area.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
And another time, I've killed two bucks. One was a 150 and a 154 in Michigan. In Michigan's, in my opinion, the toughest state in the country to kill a big buck because we got more bow hunters than any other state by quite a bit.
Just because you hunt there, that's why, right?
Well, I've hunted in a
I'm
lot
just
of
kidding.
states. I've never seen anything
Yeah.
close.
No,
And we
I actually agree with you on that. I think Michigan is. So,
well, statistically, we got about 60,000 more bow hunters than the next closest state.
yeah.
There's gun there's states that have more gun hunters, Texas obviously. But anyway, I shot a 150 14 point and a 154 10 point 50 yards from the expressway, a major expressway. And those deer, it was in a secure transition route between two bedding areas. Literally, I was 20 yards from the fence because expressways have fences down the northbound and southbound lanes, just up maybe 20, 30 yards off the highway. And I was literally about 20 yards from the fence, and the fence was lined with brush. So it had a lot of visual security cover from cars and trucks going down the highway, not to see the deer beyond the fence row. And they would transition between those two bedding areas, and it was public land. I mean, nobody ever hunted back there because it was too close to the expressway. But those deer are seriously used to that traffic. And it was interesting because obviously I saw other deer as well, does and, 2.5-year-old bucks and stuff. And cars going constantly going by. I mean, a major highway. And, but if a twig snapped and there was a deer around me, it got their attention immediately. Traffic paid no attention to it. As soon as a twig snapped or something out of the ordinary, they were all over it. They were paying attention to it. So deer are very accustomed in areas where there's consistent stuff that's non-threatening to not be afraid of it.
Yeah, and I've seen even in settings where there is a lot of hunting activity that takes place, like genuine hunting activity, whether there's rifles being fired and does getting dropped consistently, or maybe the occasional mature buck killed with a bow, etc. But actual true hunting activity taking place. Say you have a 5,000 acre block of of habitat, and on the north side of it, there's homes and roads and just general human presence. But the whole 5,000 acres receives hunting pressure. A lot of times the deer will begin favoring the northern, the closer to human pressure on that 5,000 acre section of terrain. Even if the habitat's better the further south that you go, they just generally prefer to be closer to the human presence. And I think so that way they can get kind of an audible cue, or maybe even position themselves in an area where the people can't see them, but they can start to see those trails or those roads or the house or the cabin or something where the human is going to be at, and position them. But it's heavily reliant on the habitat. If the habitat does not allow for it, then they're not going to be up nearby the human presence. But if it does, then from what I've seen, they really, even in heavily hunted areas, if they can tuck themselves up in these little areas that people overlook, kind of like next to that highway, and it even receives a lot of human pressure, they still prefer those areas if it's possible. And there might be some situations where there's just so much hunting pressure, especially on the top side near the road access, that they get shoved down into the 5,000. The further to the south through the 5,000 acres. But I've seen a lot of that, and it's been really fascinating for me to observe just even at nighttime. I think nighttime is really fascinating to see because kind of all restrictions are off for most deer unless they're getting spotlighted by somebody illegally hunting on a dirt road. But for the most part, whenever it's nighttime, you could just take you could take a paintbrush and splatter it on the map, and that's all the hot spots for all the deer, all just littered all over next to the roads and all these native fields that are fully exposed to houses and roads, etc. And then as daylight starts to come up, they all start regressing back into the timber a little bit quicker. And in my area, it's very similar to what you'd said, that kind of 45 minutes before light, bucks get back to bed. For me, it's more so right around light or 30 minutes, post sunlight. So actually, legal shooting light is whenever a lot of the bucks are getting back to their bed. And mature bucks are, from what I've seen, they're almost always the first deer back to their bed. Is that something that you've seen?
Yes, yeah, and I agree with you because Missouri is a lot much lighter pressured state than where I'm at. And when I go out of state, like to Kansas and Iowa, and even in Indiana where I was at, in Ohio, and I've killed a couple big bucks in Illinois on public land. They do tend the big bucks because there is less pressure, especially during the rut. They do tend to move well after daylight before they go into bed. I've seen them as late as 8:30, moving around searching for estrus stoves, and not being the bedding area. That doesn't happen as much in Michigan. In that highway spot that I was talking about, there was no access to where I shot those two big bucks. There was no access from the highway. You can't park on the highway and walk in. The only access to get to by the highway to hunt was on the opposite side of the section. It was a 1 mile section, and the parking lot for public land hunting was on the opposite road, from the highway. So it was a 1 mile walk back to that spot. And when I would walk back there during season, anytime I was walking through there in the daylight, there was tree stands all over the place. But once I got a half a mile, 2/3 of a mile back off the road, getting closer to the highway, uh, you just saw a lot less activity. And when I got to the highway, I literally saw no sign of hunters back there.
Whenever you're walking into that situation, we can continue to focus on this hunt, and we can move on to other ones like the deer you've got behind you and stuff. But in this setting, whenever you make it to that half-mile point, you're continuing on to where you're hunting. What's kind of what's going through your brain in terms of your human presence in that situation? Do you feel like you're maybe having an impact on them and bumping deer around as you're moving into your stand location? And if you're not, then how do you know that you're not having an impact on that? How do you know that you're capable of getting to your stand without disturbing that area by your newly introduced human pressure into that location whenever you're walking to it? Whether, let's say you're hunting that morning, and I'm assuming you went in like 2 hours before light, like you kind of generally do. And so how did you know that you weren't going to disturb all of those deer and potentially have a chance at getting one killed that morning?
I didn't. I didn't know I wasn't going to spook a deer. Keep in mind, this is all timber and brush and stuff, so there's no ag in this whole section. So I'm going in, I'm in my tree. These were both all day sits. I shot both of them in the middle of the day. I shot one of them at straight up noon and one at a little bit after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And these were during rut. Okay. Um, but yeah, when I'm walking in through timber like that, because it was primarily deer were feeding on oaks and, beech nuts and chestnuts and stuff. They were on browse. So I don't remember those two specific hunts if I spooked anything, but many times when I'm walking in that far before daylight, I will bump deer. If I'm walking a long way and walking through oaks or something where deer are feeding, obviously I'm going to spook deer. But I feel like it's so far, and keep in mind I'm wearing sunlock, so I pay zero attention to wind, and I never feel like I'm leaving any odor, even if I brush against vegetation. And I've had deer walk by and never smell the vegetation, or never smell the vegetation, but never smell me. So I'm not leaving any human odor, which 90+% of bow hunters would be leaving human odor I'm just making a, a visual or a noise presence. Okay, so I'm spooking deer off to the sides, and because I'm so early going in there, I'm going in 2.5 hours before daylight for an all-day sit, and it's so early before daylight, they're not going to go bed down. They're going to keep doing what they're doing. And I would assume if there was a mature buck after I went through, or especially does that are curious as hell, mature does, once I passed through, I might have bumped them, and they might have ran 40 or 50 yards and stopped, and in the dark, and listened to me walking by. I'm sure they came back over after I was beyond them, so I wasn't a threat. They would smell the area, and if they couldn't smell any human odor, they just went on about their business. And I have that happen all the time, where I'll walk in and I'll have deer smell my, where I walked in disrupted vegetation on the ground or grasses, walking, because every time you take a step, you're disrupting the ground. They'll smell the ground, and I've had them follow while I'm in my tree. I've had them follow my footsteps, maybe 5 or 10 yards, because they smelled the ground disruption, but they didn't smell human odor, and then they just whatever and go on about their business. They don't spook, and they're just curious. So
Yeah, that's something that I've seen quite a few times is introducing just a human, or whether they're a hunter or they're driving a UTV. Oftentimes, the thing that I see the most is whenever they're on foot and they move through an area, bumping a deer away, 150 to 350 yards, and then observing that deer actually move back through that location and scent checking the exact area that that person had moved through. I've seen that quite a few times, not all the time. Sometimes they'll bump 350 yards away and they'll stay away for 10 to 12 hours before they move back through that location. But quite a few times I've seen it where within an hour they move right back through that location where the human walked through. And it is really interesting whenever they're, and oftentimes these people aren't as scent proof as you, so the deer picks up on something. But it's kind of interesting. They don't, whenever they pick up the human scent, they don't just immediately start bouncing out of that area. It is almost as if the deer that do that, that come back to the scent trail where the human just passed through, they are curious. They're very interested as to why this thing just moved through the woods, and they want to pick up on all the intricacies of it. And I think one of the reasons that I initially asked you that question, I had a point to go off of it. Oh yes, is that whenever you do spook deer, whenever you're moving through the woods and you're just walking through a continuous patch of timber, whatever, like in this setting, and you notably spook deer, you audibly hear them running away from you. What starts going through your head in that moment? Are you panicking all over the place in your brain, or are you very cool as a cucumber and you realize I need to make it to my spot and get set up in it, and you know that whenever those deer circle back, kind of what's play me through whenever you bump a group of deer, what plays through your brain in that setting?
typically, it depends on the time of year. Early season when they're feeding, if I bump a group of deer, I know it's just doing some fawns. It's maybe a swarming buck or something out feeding, in the dark. So I don't really pay much attention to it. And if I'm walking through and I hear a single big deer bump, and then when I keep walking, I smell tarsal. I can physically smell. Okay, that was a buck that I just spooked because I could smell the tarsals. So, yeah, I don't like that, but once it's done, there's nothing you can do about it. You just keep. I don't even stop. I just keep walking through the odor and just keep a steady cadence to wherever I'm going. I don't want the deer because usually wherever they go and they stop. They can still hear you moving. So I want them to think it was a steady cadence and it wasn't somebody pursuing them. I don't know their mindset at that time, but there's nothing I can do about it. The damage is done. I just go hunt and hope I didn't disturb. You know, I hope it wasn't the buck I was after, or and if it were, I hoped I didn't change his mindset and he's going to continue doing what he was doing because it's a couple hours before daylight.
Well, for me and what I've seen, whenever you go in and bump deer, if you can bump them visually, if they see you or hear you or audibly before they smell you, if they can pick up on one of those two things prior, and they're not 100% sure if you're a human or not, they just know you're something moving through the woods that shouldn't be moving through the woods at this time frame. You've often maybe even seen deer get bumped from like a raccoon scudding through the woods, or an armadillo moving through the woods. Deer, they're kind of skittish creatures. So if you can bump them with a visual or an audio cue, from what I've seen, it doesn't affect them hardly at all. They'll run that 150 to 350 yards and they'll resume general activity. But if they can pull human scent off of that equation, then you're screwed, and they will bounce out of that area at some point. Even the curious doe or curious buck that moves back through to pick up your scent, once they pick it up, they don't really just run off immediately. They kind of want to investigate for a second, but they're not going to track you. They're not going to put their nose down on your trail and come find you. They're really still interested as to where you came from and things like that, and then they bounce out of the area. They don't stay in that location. So scent kind of seems to be number one in terms of when you're bumping deer, which leads me to believe that I don't think you have a lot of an impact whenever you trudge off through the woods, because you're scentless. You don't care about the wind. And I think that's a really important thing, because that probably 99.99% of hunters, the number one thing they think about when they wake up in the morning and they go hunting is the wind direction. What's the wind direction? What's the wind speed? What are my conditions? Where am I going to set up dependent upon this? And you don't care about that. So walk us through kind of your how is that possible? What are you doing to make yourself scentless?
Oh my God, that could
The
take
whole thing.
that
We'll
could
be
take
we'll
hours.
be here for 3 hours. You don't have to
Uh,
explain the science behind it, but more
yeah,
so just kind of your thinking behind it initially whenever you
yeah,
started
yep.
discovering all of this and whatnot.
Well, I hunted through 1996, 1965 through 1996, hunting 100% the wind. Okay. So just like everybody else, I was hunting the wind. I look at the flags when I was driving down the road to figure out where I'm going to sit, and it got to the point where I was getting winded frequently enough. Like if I were hunting sides of ridges or saddles between, valleys between saddles because of the thermals coming down and swirling winds and stuff, there's places I just quit setting up. I wouldn't hunt them. So when I'm out scouting and I knew there was places where swirling winds, you throw up milkweed and 5 minutes later you throw it up and it goes the opposite 180 degrees the opposite direction. So there was places I quit hunting. And then there were trees. My light you're I have a lot of trees when I go into season, and back then every tree had to have a different wind direction for me to hunt it. And so there was a lot of times trees that I would save for the peak rut, the rut phases, which is the primary time to be out there trying to kill bucks because they're more vulnerable during the rut because they're pursuing does. There were trees that I never got to hunt during certain seasons because on my days off work I never had the right wind direction to hunt them. So my best trees didn't get hunted. And I hated that. I hated not being able to hunt valleys and sides of ridges and hunt my best tree locations because the wind wasn't right. So, you know, I'm I'm a I consider myself a relatively intelligent person, and I knew a lot about activated carbon. Okay, activated carbon was not something new to me when ScentLock came out with it. I knew every military on Earth uses activated carbon in their chemical warfare suits for so humans going into the Iraq War or in Syria, they had chemical warfare suits and respirators with carbon in them so that if they released a chemical bomb, they wouldn't get killed. That actually absorbed the chemical molecules from getting to the soldier's body. It's the same exact thing with Sunlock. It's got carbon in it, and it absorbs the human odor from going out, passing through the fabric and into the environment. And it's used in activated carbon is used by NASA in spacesuits. Every spacesuit has activated carbon in it. Every car's got activated carbon in it for filtration purposes, water softeners, paint respirators. It's used to store hydrogen gas by the U.S. government. There's literally thousands and thousands of uses for activated carbon, and it's because it's the most absorbent substance known to man at this time. And to give you an example of the porosity of activated carbon, if you took a 1 pound butter tub, you know how you buy those little plastic things with a pound of butter in them and you dip it out and put it on bread or whatever. If you emptied that out and you put 1 pound of activated coconut carbon in that one pound of it in that container, and then you took it and you could microscopically open up each particle in all the interior pores, and it's extremely cavernous. And you laid all the surfaces on all the interior pores, exterior surfaces flat, where all the surfaces were butting up to each other. In 1 pound of activated carbon, the surface area would cover over 100 acres. That's how that's how much surface area there is in these activated carbon pores. It's you almost, I mean, and they have to look at that with electron microscopes, obviously, to figure that stuff out. But you know what? I said the stuff came out in '92. I bought my first suit in '96. I got winded in '96 because I didn't know how to properly care for it and how to properly store it and how to properly use it and what to use in conjunction with it. So by mid-season 1997, um, I was to the point where I didn't have to pay attention to wind. I wore the head cover with a drop-down face mask, jacket, pants, gloves, uh, rubber boots, scent-free rubber boots. Um, if I was back then, I wasn't using aiders, but nowadays I use aiders. So I wash my aiders in scent-free detergent. Don't touch them with anything but my scent lock gloves and my sticks. My backpack back then, I was washing it in scent-free detergent and storing it in an airtight container, so it didn't have odor, because most people back then that were wearing scent lock suits, they were replicating what the TV guys were doing, and the TV guys don't know anything about clothing. They don't know squat, in my opinion, about hunting, because they're hunting like in a zoo, and those guys would wear a scent lock jacket and scent lock pants, and they'd have a logo hat on like what you're wearing right now. They'd have their hair hanging out and their beards would be exposed, their necks were exposed. 40% of your odor comes out of your head. So, you know, but they're hunting zoo type animals that don't get targeted till they're 4 years old, usually, or five, and they're used to smelling those people because those people are hunting all the time until the deer hits that 4 or 5 year old age criteria, antler criteria. That's when they target them and shoot them. It's like raising cattle till they're ready for the market. That's exactly what they do, and they don't have any hunting pressure other than themselves. And maybe they'll allow somebody to come in and cull an inferior buck, you know, but they can get away with murder because of where they hunt. That's just a fact. I mean, anybody can watch a TV show and you'll have multiple big bucks come out into a pick cornfield 2 hours before dark.
Not to take a turn off of the scent, we'll come back to it, but how destructive do you think that these trophy hunted, managed TV shows are to the hunting industry and mainly the youth that are coming up in hunting that may not have that opportunity to go out and hunt one of these crazy managed properties, and they hunt in Michigan and they hunt public land and they set these expectations in their brains? Because one thing that I've seen a lot of in youth, especially in my area, is and I know this because I've gone out and I did a little bit of tracking with my drone, and I just run into a lot of people who want to talk deer, and a lot of the kids, they see a 130-inch buck in southern Missouri and they kind of think like, oh, but dude, like that's a small whatever, like they don't really even care about that buck. It's like he's not, I'm looking for that 190 200-inch deer, and these are like, I'm talking 7 to 12-year-old little boys, and they're addicted with this 180 to 220-inch deer that are getting killed consistently. It's like, are you kidding me? Like, no, like, and then you have to try to revert the kid's brain back to like reality. Like, this is reality for us, buddy. We don't live on this managed property, and we're never going to be able to kill a 200-inch deer. But between video games now with hunting and killing ridiculous trophy animals, and then the TV shows that are being shoved towards kids, and that's kind of setting their expectation for the future of what type of deer they want to kill. How destructive do you think that is moving in the future?
I think it's very destructive. And I was a sales rep in the hunting industry for 30 some years. And I can remember a couple times going into stores and talking to young kids. When I say young, teenagers, 16, 17. I remember when one kid was 19 years old, and I asked him, how many years you been bowing? He said, oh, like 7 or 8. And I said, how many bucks you killed? He said, I've never shot one. I said, well, why? He said, well, I'm waiting for a 130 incher. Okay, and in Michigan, that's a monster.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and I said, listen, son, I said, take it from me, go target some 2.5 year old bucks, whether they're 85 and 14 inch and eight point that's 95 inches, go get some kills under your belt, because if you're setting your goals like the TV guys do, it's not going to happen. Those guys have zero competition, and they're not that skillful. If you took those guys and put them on public land in a pressured state, they wouldn't kill anything hunting the way they hunt. They're probably decent enough hunters to figure it out eventually in a few years, but they're not going to kill anything. And you know, in when you do anything with a lack of competition, there's no way of measuring your skill set. When you take all professional athletes, Tom Brady, Phil Mickelson, Tiger Woods, Michael Phelps, Mickey Mantle, Michael Jordan, You know, those guys competed against kids in middle school and high school. And if they were good enough in high school, they went to college, they got scholarships to college to play ball. And if they were good enough in college, they got to play in the pros. And by the time they've reached the icon status, you know, like the TV guys think they have, by the time the professional athletes have reached the icon status, they've literally, when you pyramid it down to all the players they've outcompeted and the players they've outcompeted and the players they've outcompeted, they've outperformed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to get to the icon status. And they did it on the exact same playing fields and golf courses and tracks and swimming pools. The TV guys compete against nobody. They grow bucks until they're big enough to kill, and then they go out and kill them. And they come out into wide open areas during daylight hours. And that, you can't measure somebody's skill set who doesn't hunt against competition. And I'm just going to leave that at that.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfectly said. So, and actually, one thing I have to show you now, since you brought up Mickey Mantle, it's a new decor. It's
That's
a
a
new
little old
decor
school,
piece
dude.
for my office.
Oh my
Mickey
God.
Mantle Boulevard, baby. Yeah. You're talking to a Yankees fan, and I love Mickey Mantle. So that's actually, I've had that for a while,
Wow.
and I just found it in my storage unit, and I was like, oh my gosh, that has to go up in my office, Mickey Mantle Boulevard. So now it has to go up
Whoa.
in the office. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. I just happened to
Oh
pull
yeah.
him out of the hat for a baseball
Yeah.
player.
Well,
How do you
he's a
guys
great
sure
one to pull out.
who he is?
That's funny. But um back to the
Yeah,
I think you've ended that on a proper note. Back to the scent thing. One thing that I was interested is you said you were still bumping deer in 1996. Um, Once you kind of dialed it in and you figured out your scent lock process, how many times have you spooked or bumped deer after that? Like, so you have everything dialed in. You knowingly are scentless in your world at that time. Have you bumped deer just potentially whenever you're in a hunting situation and you think maybe it was because they got your wind, they got your scent, they got
while I'm in the tree on stand?
yeah,
No, never,
never.
never.
That's cool.
The only times I've bumped deer is obviously I bumped deer walking in.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You know, that has nothing to do with sunlight. But they don't smell me if they come back to smell what was there. The only time I don't like Scentless rain gear. Okay, so if it's raining, and I love hunting in light drizzle to a light rain, um, because I don't like Scentless rainwear. I will wear a Rivers West. I think they're the best rainwear in the country. I will wear a Rivers West over my Scentlock suit. Okay, so my Rivers West, I've washed it in scent-free detergent, dried it, and immediately come out of the dryer and go in an airtight container. So I'm caring for that just like I do with my Scentlock. Although the Scentlock I don't wash, I just deabsorb it in the dryer. That's how you read. That's how you deabsorb carbon. Um, but there are times when I've worn my Rivers West over my Scentlock. That's my Rivers West is pristine, I think. And I have had deer come in from downwind during a light drizzle and a light breeze that have, in fact, I sent an email to a guy this morning on this very topic that have stopped and just did a little nose curl and then just kind of veered away, not spooked. They just got a little more human odor than they felt comfortable with, and they just veered away and went. It's not like they all out winded me and blew and turned around and ran off. There was just a little more human odor there than they wanted to accept, so they veered away. But that's because I was wearing a non-technical garment over my Scentlock. When I've just had my Scentlock on as my exterior and my Scentlock backpack and everything's taken care of and in the tree and my aiders are washed in scent-free detergent, um, I I cannot remember being winded. And to give you an example, from 1965 through 1996, I shot 8 bucks with my bow. So that's 32 seasons. I shot 8 bucks. From 1997, when I started properly using Scentlock, to through 2025, which is 28 seasons, I think, I shot 49 bucks. So in my first 30 some seasons, I shot 8, and in my last 28 seasons, I've shot 49. with someone. It's a game changer. It's the biggest game changer there is. People just don't want to believe it because they can't. And when I first started using Sunlock, I never ever thought I would not have to pay attention to the wind. That was the farthest thing from my mind. I thought it would give me a little bit of advantage. Maybe a few bucks will think I'm farther away from them and I'm not a threat and they'll move by. Okay, because there's such a little amount of human odor. But I mean, it's blown me away. I have deer downwind of me all the time because I don't pay attention to wind unless I'm setting up a tree like at a primary scrape area. Then I will set up a tree on the downwind side of what would normally be the prevailing wind. So if there's the prevailing winds out of the northwest, usually during the rut phases, I'll set up a tree 20 to 25 yards off the scrapes on the southeast side, southeast side, and then I'll make a shooting lane 25 yards south or southeast of me from the tree. So now I'm covering 50 yards downwind from the scrapes, and because a lot of times when big bucks in a pressured area, when they come in to check a scrape area in the daytime, and usually it's in the middle of the day, they'll come in and check it from downwind. They won't physically go to the scrape area because scrape areas are always in a little bit of an open zone. There's always open area where there are physically scrapes. They'll come stay in the security cover and check it from downwind, and if they don't smell anything, they'll just go back. They won't physically go to the scrapes and work.
And how do you define a primary scrape versus just a standard one-off scrape? How do you identify those and recognize in your brain that this is a primary scrape? What defines a primary scrape to you?
Primary scrape areas are typically two, three, or four scrapes in a small, maybe a 10-yard zone. Maybe they're on autumn olive bushes, or maybe there's an apple tree with low hanging branches, and there's three or four scrapes around the perimeter, or an oak tree, or whatever the food mass tree is in the area, persimmon tree. Or a primary scrape area could be in a narrow pinch point of a transition zone between two bedding areas or between a bedding and a feeding area where there's a concentrated amount of doe traffic. One thing about a primary scrape areas are always 100% of the time always made where there's a lot of doe activity, an influx of doe activity. That's why there are scrapes there. So you may find an old logging trail or something that bucks go down at night and there being a scrape every 40, 50 yards along that trail. Or you may find a single scrape out underneath an oak tree, or, where some does hang around or something. But when you find a primary scrape area, it's going to be one of the locations in that core area where there's a lot of influx of doe activity. So it's typically around feeding zones because that's what does are primarily doing is feeding. So usually it's around apple trees, oak trees, or pinch points in transition security cover between bedding and feeding. It can be a single scrape too. It can be a single big dished out scrape. It doesn't have to be three or four.
Yeah, I've seen very similar things, and I've seen some scripts you saying that it can be one single dished out script. I don't know if you've ever seen anything like this, and I don't know that I've asked anybody about them, but I have this one spot that I found probably 8 years ago or 9 years ago. I was quite a bit younger, and it's like 6 foot by 6 foot, and it is just dug out every single year. And I've had a camera on it for quite a few years now, and one of the things that I've noticed happens at this spot more often than not are younger bucks come to it and they stand in it and they spar inside of this spot. And I've always wondered if anyone else has seen or these features where it's just this ridiculous. It may be 7 foot by 7 foot. I could lay down in it and spin in it. I mean, there's so much space in this scraped out spot, and it's this really fertile, warm black dirt, like really dark, which we don't have fertile, but that's not a thing for my area. So it's kind of down at the bottom of where everything runs off down to this bottom, and it's really fertile and black. And I mean, it is like 7 foot by 7 foot or 6 foot by 6 foot of a circle of a scrape. And I've always called it a scrape, I guess. I mean, there is scraping activity that takes place in it, but a lot of bucks also go to it and they spar. It's kind of like, like at a playground, they pick out the spot behind all the equipment where the teachers can't see them and they spar in this spot. And I don't know if you've ever seen anything like that before.
I've seen big scrapes, a single primary scrape area. No, I've never seen one 6 foot. No, I've seen probably the biggest is 4 foot, and they're usually dished out. It was dished out like 3 inches deep in the center, maybe. But I've seen many occasions where young bucks would come in and spar at primary scrape areas. I've seen that multiple times.
Yeah, I've seen also back to your point about your hunting strategy on primary scrapes where you kind of set up downwind of them because bucks are wrapping them and scent checking them from the side. I've seen that quite a few times as well, where a buck will, especially if it's a scrape that's in an exposed area. I
Right.
see bucks very typically moving kind of in those staging areas, and there's really no rhyme or reason as to whether or not that's truly what they're doing, that they're scent checking that scrape, but they're positioning themselves downwind of it, and then oftentimes I'll see them bed in that staging area location, kind of nearby where that scrape is out in the open. And then as night comes in, they'll move out and they'll hit the scrape at nighttime. Pretty often I've seen that before.
Here,
What is it?
can I
Oh,
interrupt for a second?
yeah. How about it?
Because you said you've never seen something where you could say for 100% for sure where he was coming in to scent check it from downwind. You
Yeah.
said you've never seen
Yeah,
something.
well, like, yeah, from the drone's perspective, I've never observed where like I can guarantee you that's why he was downwind of the scrape. I've seen it a lot where they truly are downwind of the scrape, but there's no it's really hard to tell with a drone whenever you're looking at a deer. You can count the hairs on their head, but still to kind of get into their brain and think as to what they're trying to do in that moment in time, sometimes it's pretty difficult.
Well, that 154-inch buck that was by the highway in that pinch point between the two bedding areas. Remember me telling you
Yep.
that I shot him a little bit after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That was a buck that there was a scrape there because that's a pinch between two bedding areas. Um, there was a lot of doe traffic that went through there as well because the highway basically made that a pinch point. The highway helped in making that a very tight pinch, and it had the adequate security cover for daytime traffic. And I was hunting for this specific 10 point, that 154 incher, and I'm sitting in my tree, and I could see him coming up out of the one bedding area because it was low ground. I could see him coming up, and he was walking right towards the scrapes. So I'm in my saddle, and I grabbed my bow, and I'm assuming he's going to come and give me a 20-yard shot. I had a 20-yard shot to the physical scrapes, and when he got before he would break the brush, because there was brush on the outside edge of the scrape area, before he broke the brush, he turned and he went to the east, and I had a shooting lane to the east. So I swung around 180 degrees in my saddle, getting ready to shoot at my shooting lane. And by the time I had my bow and I got all set, his ass was going through my shooting lane to the east. So I swung back around 180 degrees to where I was initially, and he circled around and he came into my other shooting lane that I had downwind of me, okay, where I said I could shoot up to 50 yards downwind. He came into that shooting lane, so I was turned like this, but now he's walking. When he got in my shooting lane, he walked right up my shooting lane. So I'm not taking that straight on shot. And he walked right up my shooting lane. He stopped directly below me, right where I was standing on the ground. And, I had my backpack on the ground, tied my bow to my rope, and, when I climbed the tree. And he stood right there, and he's downwind of the scrapes now, directly downwind of the scrapes, and he did a lip curl. He wasn't lip curling because anything of my scent. He was actually, his head was beyond the tree, but his body was right below me. And he did a lip curl, and nothing had been there. So he turned around and walked right back straight away down that shooting lane that he came in on. And I'm not taking that shot either. Okay. I wasn't going to take that straight away shot. So I'm like, well, shit, I'm not going to get a shot. He's going to that other bedding area. When he got to where he had came in from the east, he turned and walked right back around. He was going right back around in the exact same footprints he came in on. So he was coming in strictly to scent check that scrape area, and then he was going back to the bedding area he was originally in.
Yeah.
So when I seen him get off of my shooting lane and go back east, I swung back around the tree to prep on that shooting lane, and when he went through that shooting lane, I shot him. So he was definitely coming in strictly to scent check that scrape area.
That's pretty cool.
That
The
was
one
way cool.
another another thing that I've seen on scrapes that's actually kind of cool is I was recording this one buck I was doing research on. He was a big mainframe 9, a really pretty deer, probably in this area. He was probably 5 years old, I think. I don't have past history with him, but he was over 4. And he had this one scrape that he was actually out in the open technically, but it was out in the open in a small little field that nobody ever went to. So he would go out to the edge of this field and he would make this scrape. And I'd observed him doing it probably 4 days in 1 week in daylight very consistently. And we had a trail camera in that area. I had a trail camera in that area for research. And I kind of thought to myself, well, this would be pretty interesting. Like, say that I was in a hunting situation in that area and I saw him come to the scrape and make a scrape, and I was like, oh, he hits that scrape, so I'm going to move my camera closer to his scrape and not do any scent and whatever for myself. I don't have any of the gear to even try to do it. I'm going to go in as a stinky human. I'm going to move the trail camera over this fresh scrape that he is hitting actively almost every single day, every week, and set it up on him and see what happens. So I moved in at literally, it was probably 3 hours after he hit that scrape. I let him walk away and he moved off to his bed. And I snuck in there on foot, and because I knew exactly where he's at. And I moved the trail camera within 30 yards, probably it was probably 20 yards of his scrape, and I aimed it in his direction. So I had to move it to a whole new tree, and I aimed it in his direction. And I just stunk up that whole trail camera. And if I find the photos before I post this podcast, I'll put it up here. The very next day, at in the morning, he came in to hit that scrape, and his face is right next to the trail camera. He's smelling the trail camera. Never hit that scrape again. Never.
Yep.
In fact, he never walked into that field, that little opening again, all season long. In fact, a week later, he completely relocated his area off of that spot. He went to a completely
Wow.
different ridge, a completely different section, which I think was part of his home range already. But he did completely relocate out of that little zone. It was no longer part of his core area during daylight activity. He may have gone there at nighttime, but what's that?
How old a deer did you say he was, do you think?
I think he was 4 minimum, but I just
Oh,
looking at him from my
wow.
area, I think that he was 5. And yeah, no, he picked up on the trail camera immediately, and he never showed back up. And I think that happens a lot with guys where maybe they'll go in and they'll do their scouting right on top of a hunting, or right before they're going to go in and hunt, or maybe they have private land and they have access to drive around it, whatever. And they see a fresh scrape and they're, oh, I'll put a trail camera up over that scrape, and you just burn that scrape immediately. That doesn't mean that no other deer are ever going to come and hit that scrape. They might come through. I've seen doe, like on that. I left that trail camera there for 2 months, I think, and there were does and some other deer that came in and hit the scrape, and some younger bucks, and actually one decent 3-year-old buck came in and hit the scrape. But that was a couple weeks later, and anyway, it wasn't him. I was
It
looking
was,
for
yeah,
him.
it wasn't the one you
And
wanted.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I was just looking for the effect that it would have on him, and it dramatically affected him. He completely relocated the area, which I found pretty interesting.
That is, I'll tell you something else interesting about the whole scent thing is back when I wasn't using sunlock, you know, I couldn't hunt a tree more than 2 or 3 times in a season because I was leaving odor. And I talk to hunters all the time. You know, they'll go to a tree, let's say it's a feeding location, and it's got a considerable amount of doe activity, so they want to, that's going to be a good spot if it continues dropping food into the rut phases. Well, if they hunt that 2 or 3 times and they don't have a scent control regiment that works, you know, each time you hunt it, your deer numbers are going to typically go down because you are leaving residual human odor there that those deer can smell hours after dark after you leave that location. And if you're hunting a big mature buck, the odds are if he smells that human odor at that location, he's not going to come into that location in the daylight hours. So unknowingly, when because of your entries, getting in the tree, leaving, even though you're not seeing the deer, the buck you're trying to kill, but you know he's there, he's definitely going to avoid that spot during daylight hours. And by hunting it multiple times prior to the rut phases, you're also altering the doe activity. So even during the rut, now the does aren't coming in there during daylight hours. They'll come in after dark and feed, and then the bucks will come in after dark with the does. But they're not doing it during daylight hours. So your human odor affects hunting locations big time. I mean, if you're after specific types of animals.
I think that's one thing that makes the saddle so effective. Even if you're not utilizing a scent regimen and you just don't have the patience for it, or you're a really stinky person and you just don't even feel like it's possible. I think that is one thing that makes a saddle so effective because whenever I was younger, I guess this was whenever my wife was my girlfriend. I'd taken her hunting, up to this field, and this was the first time we ever went hunting, and I had a specific doe that she was going to kill because I had tree stands up in this location. I didn't use a saddle at the moment, so I wasn't bebopping from tree to tree. And I knew the stand we were going to sit in, and I knew this doe very well. And as soon as she walks in the field, she's going to look right up at that tree stand from over 100 yards away. She'll just beat on it every single time. And if she sees anything outside of the normal, she's gone. And I had my rifle, set up in the ladder stand on the bar, aiming that location, the exact trail that she walks down every single time. And I said, this doe is going to randomly appear there whenever we're not paying attention. And I am going to need you to ease your head down on this rifle and squeeze off a trigger. No movement. You can't do anything else. She's going to be looking at you, and you're going to ease your head down and squeeze off the trigger. So we had the gun ready. 45 minutes passes. She shows up, and I tell my wife, Kinsey, I'm like, she's there. She's there. So she kind of looks over in that area, and she moved her left hand to rest it on the stock. And I told her specifically not to do that. I said, move your head down and squeeze off a shot. Do not move anything else. She moved her left hand, and as soon as she moved her left hand forward, doe bounced off and ran. It's like, are you kidding me? So I had to come back a couple weeks later and finish her off myself. But it was just like, this deer is insane. But it was just kind of an interesting thing. And you yourself, you've probably utilized the saddle longer than most people even know. Long time, right?
I don't think there's probably anybody in the country that's hunted out of a saddle longer than I
Yeah.
did.
When did you start? Was it
1980?
in the 1981? My goodness.
Yeah.
So what was it like bow hunting back in you started bow hunting in the 60s, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
What was it like bow hunting then versus bow hunting in the 80s?
Totally different. I mean, there was not nearly the quantity of deer. We had Michigan had 1 million gun hunters back in the 60s and 70s. So 2.5-year-old bucks were very rare sightings, and plus there was a lot fewer deer in southern Michigan where I lived at the time. There was a lot of deer in northern Michigan. But 60s, if you wanted to get bow hunting permission, it was easy. Probably 9 out of 10 people you knocked on their door would give you bow hunting permission. They'd say, you want to do what? Yeah, go knock yourself out. Because back then, DNR statistics, only 2% of bow hunters in the 60s and 70s, up until the compound bow came out, because I was hunting with a recurve then, only 2% of bow hunters killed an antlered buck with a bow. 2%. Now it's probably 30 to 40%. So it was tougher. I loved it. Then when we got into the compound bows came out, that's when bow hunting really started to spike because it was easier. People always gravitate to things that are easier. And, bow hunter numbers climbed big time. And then the TV guys started coming out in the late 80s and 90s. And, they made everybody now wants to kill big bucks like we discussed a while ago, with the kids issue and stuff. And so people started passing on bucks, and now there's just lots of deer every place. And killing a 2.5-year-old buck nowadays is not that big of a deal. I mean, you could win a buck pull contest for an entire county with a 100-inch buck in the 70s and early 80s. Literally. I mean, our county record was 151 inches for until probably 1999, I think it was. 151 inches. That was our county record with gun. Okay. So gun hunter numbers have declined dramatically. Michigan's just a little over 600,000 gun hunters now. A lot of gun hunters have converted to hunting with crossbows because it's nicer weather and they can fill their tags in nice weather and get to actually watch social activity. So by the time gun season rolls around, their tags are full. Plus, most gun hunters are older and they're dying off. Bow hunter numbers have kind of stayed relatively level over the last, I'd say, 10 or 15 years because I keep all the stats on that for the books I've written. And bow hunting is a lot easier now than it was because there are so many there's so many people passing on deer, even in Michigan. Killing a 2.5-year-old buck in Michigan is, depending on where you live and what public land you're hunting, it can be a challenge, but it's not that difficult to kill a 2.5-year-old. Back in the old days, 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s, killing a 2.5-year-old was a serious, serious chore.
Yeah,
So,
my grandpa, he's actually been bow hunting since the late 50s, so really similar time frame. And actually, I don't know if you can see it, probably not in this camera platform, but the podcast guys will be able to see it. That's an Allen bow, and that is the
oh
fifth Allen
wow,
bow. It's the fifth one ever built. I can pull it down and show it to you after the podcast,
whoa,
but
I've
fifth one ever
seen
built.
those.
And yeah, my grandpa it had actually. I don't think he was the one that bought it, but two of his friends bought one, and then a third of his friends bought one, and the third friend didn't want it anymore because it was like, this piece of junk. I'm going back to my recurve bow. And my grandpa bought it off of him, and it has number 5 inscribed on the side. It was the fifth one ever built, and he used it for quite a while, and then he gave it to my dad. And I know my dad will appreciate this story. It's a pretty cool story of his. He took it into Bass Pro Shops
Mhm.
in, I don't remember the exact time, whenever Bass Pro was big enough to have a bow shop, maybe late 80s, early 90s, probably the 90s. And he took it in there and he set it on the counter, and he's like, I'd like to have some arrows built for this bow. And the guy behind the desk almost had a stroke, and he looked at him and was like, absolutely not, you're not shooting that thing. And my dad was like, it's my only bow, I need you to make me arrows. So the guy went back, and he went back into his shop, and he pulled out all of these pieces to his Allen bow he was trying to build, and he set them on the table, and he's like, for the last 10 years I've been trying to build an Allen bow, and you just brought in it, you can't see it, it's perfect. You just brought in a perfect Allen bow full of all the pieces.
Wow,
And so the guy reluctantly built him arrows, and he built him some autumn orange, the Easton X55s, aluminum arrows.
XX75s.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And so that's what my dad shot for quite a few years, and they're feathered fletching and stuff, and
probably
really cool bow.
2219s, probably the
Yeah, yeah.
heaviest.
I think that's what they are. I can't read it from here. How long did it take you to transition from your recurve to a compound?
I transitioned in 1975 to a Bear Polar 2. I remember when that bow first came out, the one you're talking about. It had a 15% let off, which is like nothing, and it's heavy. The bow weighed a ton.
Yeah.
Um, and then he tried to get Fred Bear to make that bow commercially, and Fred wouldn't do it. And then Jennings kind of stole his patents, and Jennings became a real popular compound bow maker back in the 70s. I was an archery buyer at Michigan's largest sporting goods store in the late 70s. And but anyway, Tom Jennings took his patents and ran with them, and the Allen sued him because he did not have permission to use his patents.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time it took over 10 years for that to run through the court system, and when Allen finally won that lawsuit, it put Jennings out of business. But Allen had the original patent on compound bows.
How much has your I know we've shifted focus from buck bedding and everything, but how much has your arrow changed over time? From the 60s, your recurve arrow, all the way till modern day modern arrows.
Well, obviously, the old arrows with recurves were all cedar arrows with the tips glued onto them, and they were all feathers. And then when I went to a compound, by the time compounds came out, there was aluminum arrows, game getters, XX75s. So you just had to pick out the arrow spine for whatever your bow weight and draw length was. And then I got a Matthews Pro Staff, and I shot PSE in between there. Had bought a PSE, and then I was shooting a Matthews 60-pound bow, and I was still using carbon when I no, I had switched to carbons. I was on Carbon Express's Pro Staff, so I was shooting Maxima Reds 250s. And recently, in the last 8 years, 7 or 8 years, because of my shoulders, I'm shooting a 40-pound Matthews now, and I'm shooting a very light Maxima Red. I don't even think they make them anymore, but they're 150s, and I'm only shooting it at 40 pounds, so because of my shoulders. So I'm shooting a lot lighter arrow and a lot smaller cut fixed blade broadhead. I was shooting mechanicals when I was shooting a 60-pound bow, but my bow at 40 pounds doesn't have the oomph to push an inch and a half mechanical through through the boiler system.
How frequently have you wounded deer throughout? Mainly, I feel like a recurve would be a pretty easy one to sling one into the wrong spot, but mainly whenever you became really efficient with a modern compound bow, and from then on, and whenever you're probably undergoing a lot of changes through arrows, and then maybe hopping onto mechanicals and off mechanicals and on mechanicals, and then back to your fixed blades. How frequently? Because it seems like you put deer down a lot. How frequently do you wound them?
I've wounded deer. Last year, I wounded a 9 point that I did not recover. It wasn't a big 9 point. It was a Michigan buck. It was smaller than that small one there behind me. Um, but I've wounded deer in the past. Back in the recurve days and in my early compound days, um, I tended to body shoot. I think that was a pretty common thing where you'd shoot deer in the liver and the guts a lot, center massing them because it's a bigger target, and staying away from the shoulder with a 45-pound recurve because you didn't want to hit the shoulder blade. So you aimed a little farther back. So I gut shot some deer that I did not recover, but I mean I killed them. I know when you gut shoot a deer or hit them in the liver, they're dead. They don't they can't recover from that. I just never personally recovered the deer, and I'd say probably I'd say every 7 or 8 years, on average, I will wound a deer that I do not
That's a pretty,
recover.
that's a pretty good return rate. So yeah, I did. With the thermal drone comes the implication of tracking for people. You just naturally, because in 2024 I moved down to where I live now in southern Missouri, and I started getting a lot of just natural phone calls like, "Oh, you have a thermal drone, you can come track my deer. It's wounded, etc." And there is a massive epidemic of people just slinging arrows left and right at deer and wounding them all the time. And a mixture of that is inexperience. I think there's a strong mix where honestly probably over 60 to 70% other guys that have tracked that listen to this podcast can pin their opinions as well, have been crossbows. And a lot of times those bolts are pretty light. And then they throw on a very light mechanical onto the front of it. And they think that they're Superman at that point. So they take a 50-plus yard shot and they slam it to the shoulder blade or a ball joint or something. And they don't get any penetration. The deer lives and they don't understand why. And I even see that with newer hunters that get into compound bows and they take it to a bow shop and asked, "Can you just please make my arrows up for me?" And they slapped together in total, 380 to 425 grain arrow, and they're not near as precise with their bow or comfortable. Really, that's probably the biggest thing at shooting at a live animal like you are, because you've been doing it for so long. Because there's a lot of emotions that come with that whenever you actually draw back on an animal in the moment versus shooting at your target. And they make a bad shot with these lighter arrows with a large cut on contact mechanical, and in return they're just wounding deer left and right. I have never gone and tracked a deer that was shot with a decently weighted for their draw length and draw weight arrow with a cut on contact head. Never, not once. If most of those arrows they're over 475 to 500 grains, cut on contact, dialed in properly, they fly straight, they don't flex. Whenever they hit on impact, they're not hitting at a canter, and they just fly right through deer left and right. But it's always these people that have improperly tuned bows with light arrows, and they maybe they don't practice enough yet, or they just don't have enough experience under their belt still, and they take kind of a little bit longer shots than they should on deer, and they slam it in shoulder blades. And I see that a lot. And that's kind of why I was interested though, is because you've been doing it for so long so successfully, and now in modern day you're drawing 40 pounds. And a lot of people, there's probably some people that watch this video that hear 40 pounds and kind of scoff at it like you should move to a crossbow because that's not enough draw weight to shoot a deer with. And it's like, no, you can definitely kill a deer with 40-pound draw weight, and you're kind of proving that every
You
single
just
year.
have,
So
yeah, you just have to have the adequate cut head for the weight of the arrow, because the lighter the arrow, the less energy you have. And like if you shot, like you said, if you shoot a light arrow and you've got a 1.5 to 2 inch cut mechanical and you mess with the shoulder blade at all, you're not going to get enough penetration. But if you shoot a lighter arrow, for 40 pounds, and I'm shooting an 1.1 inch cut fixed blade, so I don't have to use any of my energy to deploy the blades on a mechanical. I'm not losing any energy there, and I'm shooting a very small cut. I never have any issues with penetration. But I do have to be a little bit more careful on where I aim, obviously.
yeah, I could go down the arrow rabbit hole for a really long time because I obsess over gear sometimes. That's kind of what happens to you whenever you move to the city and you can't do as much hunting for a little while. Like I could, I was very time restrained to my job, so I just researched the gear versus actually going out and scouting and hunting more often. I think a lot of people get wrapped in that trap. One thing that I wanted to bring up is that you have a new series of 3 books that have come out here recently, And I know you wanted to mention them, and I also wanted to just kind of ask personally what kind of went into those 3 books, and what was your thinking and the mindset between one, separating them into 3 books? Was it just because you had so much content that you needed to share, you had to separate it into three? And also just, yeah, just tell us a little bit about them.
Okay. And then when I get done with this, I want to ask you some questions because the drone thing is very interesting to me, and we haven't talked that much about your
Yeah,
drone.
no, we haven't.
Well,
That's fine. We don't need to talk about drones for sure.
when I retired, almost the day after I retired, I've been wanting to write another book. I had written three bow hunting books, and they're still out there. They're on Amazon and they're on my website, and they've done extremely well. And but after I retired, it had been 15 years since I wrote my last book. So I started writing a new book, and it took me 18 months. And when I'm saying this, this is a God's honest truth. I spent 8 to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, for almost 18 months writing this book. Everything I know is in. I didn't leave anything out. This covers every terrain feature, hill country, swamps, pine flats down in the south, because Greg Godfrey is a co-author and he used to live in Florida and Georgia and he hunted down there. Um, and every weapon, it doesn't matter what weapon, but the new book series I did was gonna, after I was done, it was gonna be 800 pages, almost 800 pages, and you can't print an 1,800 page book, so I had to break it down into a 3 book series, and I actually have them here, so I'll show them to you. That's book volume 1. That's book volume 2. And that's book volume 3. Get that over there a little bit. And just to give you an idea of what's in these are the chapters, if you don't mind me saying them. Um, got a very long introduction. Andy May, who does a lot of podcasts, Mark Kenyon, Garrett Prawl, DIY Sportsman, Ernie Power with Tethered, Greg Godfrey with Tethered, they've all contributed a little bit to this. So the introduction is relatively long because it gives bios and stuff. Then now I'm going to go into the regular hunting chapters. Hunting pressure realities. That lays out a foundation of the different types of hunting pressure, and then it's to you to figure out which type of hunting pressure you hunt in, and that will dictate what part of this book you need to follow, to be successful where you're hunting. What type of pressure are you hunting in? So hunting pressure realities, there's a chapter on saddle hunting, chapter on 4 segments of the season, just naming those segments and a little bit of information on them. Postseason scouting, early season and lull, that's 2 of the segments, but that's a chapter. Pre and peak rut, post rut and late season is a chapter. Rut staging areas, hunting from the ground, hunting standing corn, open to hunting public lands, that's a relatively long chapter. Suburban hunting, location preparation tools, location preparation, DIY freelance hunting, where you just grab your bow and sticks and you just take off on public land and destination unknown, find a spot to hunt and hunt. Scent control, that's a seriously long and very in-depth chapter, and it needs to be because people need to understand. That's a 44-page chapter. That's probably the longest chapter in the whole.
You sent me that chapter, and I've already read it, and it was very good.
Thank you. Preseason and in-season scouting, preseason speed tours, motion cameras, fake hunting tactics like rattling, sparring, scents, whatever. What to take hunting, hunting in inclement weather, recovering bow shot whitetails, travel hunting, hunting access, and health and conditioning. And the goal is to the readers. My goal has always been to make hunters, no matter what their weapon of choice is and no matter what type of terrain they're hunting, to make them a serious threat to the mature bucks wherever they're hunting. That's always been my goal. So it just cuts the learning curve down dramatically. And I think there's a lot of stuff in there for relatively seasoned hunters as well. And again, I've been hunting 60 years, and it's been strictly public walk-on and free permission properties. And I've got 59 bucks in the record book. And on my website, which is deer, DEER, hyphen JOHN.net, you can buy signed copies of everything that goes out of my house is signed, and it'll be the paper books like this, paperback. They're also available paperback, hardcover at Tethered on Tethered's website, and on Amazon.com you can get paperback, hardcover, ebooks, and audiobooks. And I did the narration on the audiobooks, and the audiobooks are also available on Spotify. And one other thing is that's kind of what's on that board in the back is the books and where you can get them. I'm going to do a YouTube video that'll probably be out by the time this podcast airs, and it's going to be Eberhart Outdoors video number 168 because I've had that YouTube channel for quite a while. And on that particular YouTube, I'm going to request the viewers to email me questions. So I'm going to start something new for me anyway. I'm sure other people do this on podcasts where people can send me questions and then I'll do YouTube videos answering those questions to the best of my ability.
Yeah, and all of those links to everything, your YouTube channel, your website, all that information, I'll get all that from you, and we'll include it in the description of the podcast, and on this will be on YouTube as well, so it'll all be in the description for the YouTube video. So if you guys are watching, you're wondering where those links are, they'll all be in the description, and I'd highly recommend. I think that I have like almost three times. I checked out your YouTube channel. I have almost 3 times more subscribers than you do, which is like it's like a cardinal sin in my opinion that should not be allowed.
Oh, I think
I,
it's awesome
I
because
I
you got
highly disagree with that. No, I think it's a terrible thing. So everyone go to John's YouTube channel and subscribe to him right now, or I will never post another video on YouTube again. Um, Another thing I wanted to talk about
Hey
after
Derek,
the
Derek, I've got to compliment you, man. You've came up with something that's so damn unique. This drone thing is a big thing. It gets talked about a lot. You did the work. You went out there. You put a year plus into this before you even started doing the videos. So well earned. And, I've got YouTube with just general information like other people do. So you're doing something very unique. So way more power to you. I'm glad you've got 70 plus thousand subscribers.
I appreciate it, but still, you're John Eberhart. You should have more subscribers than me. Another another another
Doesn't
thing I
work that
wanted to
way, dude.
that's how it should work. Another thing that I wanted to bring up was the 2 bucks that are on the table behind you, and we can start with the one that you called earlier, the smaller one, even though he looks very unique and interesting. Tell me a little bit about those hunts and kind of what went into them, where you killed them, etc.
The smaller one there is a Michigan buck, and um, I actually had a bigger buck on camera, and that buck came in, and he was going behind some trees. The foliage was still on at the time, and the big buck I had on camera was the only 8 point or the only 10 point that I had on camera, and he was bigger. So when this guy came through, I saw that it was a 10 point. So when he went behind some trees and he opened up a little bit where I had a shot into his vitals, I took the shot. And then when I walked up on him, he's a little bit smaller than the buck that I had on camera. So I was I was a little disappointed, and then I'm like, why are you disappointed in this?
Yeah.
That's a nice,
He looks like he has a lot of character to
a
him,
lot of
like some
mass.
yeah, some palmated mass and all sorts of
Yeah,
weird stuff
just
going
got
on
short,
here.
just got short tines. The second one was from Iowa. That was a 9 point, public land, and it was on my second hunt. I was all day sits, and I shot him at 2:30 in the after two something in the afternoon, and I was just hunting in a transition corridor, between bedding areas, and that was on November. I always go out there during uh, end of peak rut into post rut. I shot him on I think November 19th, if I remember right. But it was a midday buck, and my son Joe was with me, and um, almost every decent buck he saw after that, because he ended out there for several more weeks. Almost every big buck he saw was in the middle of the day, between 11 and 2:30.
You guys have a theory as to why that was?
No, I don't have a theory as to why that. It's on an island, big island, and it's all bedding. The whole damn thing is bedding. Tall weeds, nasty briars, brush, and they just move around in there. We were there, you know, kind of late end of the peak rut, and they were just moving around with does. And then after the doe, most of the does were bred, they were still running around searching for late estrus does. And it was typically during the middle of the day.
Do you think there was quite a bit of hunting pressure before you guys got there?
No, because you had to access it with a boat. So there was hunting pressure, but not a lot.
Yeah, I was initially thinking maybe the deer had grown used to and accustomed to human pressure in the morning and evenings, and they were having heightened activity in their bed. But there's still, especially whenever even in post rut and stuff, I see a ton of midday activity with bucks that are just up and cruising, especially through bedding areas and thickets like that. That's really common.
That's why when I leave for out of state, I usually go late peak rut into post rut. Love post rut hunting in states where their gun season doesn't open until December.
Another thing that you'd said about the first buck was that you're running a trail camera and you had a photo of a bigger buck on your trail camera. So I wanted to ask, whenever you get trail camera pictures of, say, the bigger buck and maybe this buck, etc., um, do you try to learn anything from that, or do you just take it for what it is and you go, okay, there's a big buck in the area, period. Or is there anything that you try to extrapolate from the fact that you got a picture of him, the way he's moving, the time, weather, etc., things like that?
Well, anytime I put out a camera, and it was pretty close to my hunting location, I put it in an area where deer are going to naturally go through that zone. So about the only thing I can extrapolate out of cameras is what time they're going through. And typically, because this was private, that was on private again. Um, and there's only two other guys that hunt that private property. It's 37 acres of huntable land. It's a large farm, but almost all of it's in ag. So there's 37 acres of huntable land, and that buck came through late in the morning. And but usually when I've got deer on camera, they're at feeding locations like at oaks, white oaks, not usually red oaks, but white oaks because that's what they prefer the most. Or um, a lot of public lands in Michigan have lost apple trees back in bedding areas and stuff. And one thing we were going to talk about bedding areas and how do you identify bedding areas. And when I'm in Michigan, especially on public lands, if I can walk to a location standing up and it's got a lot of sign, let's say there's four scrapes here and there's 15 rubs around this, within 20 yards of this scrape area. If I can walk there from the parking lot, I'm not going to set it up because if there's a big buck hitting that spot during season, and keep in mind, I'm finding these locations during postseason, after the snow melts. But if there's a big buck hitting that location during season, it's going to be after dark because other people are going to find that location and set up on it during preseason and hunt it during the early part of the season. And they're going to screw it. They're physically going to screw that up for that big buck before the season even opens. Because there's so much human activity there, he may come in and visit it at night, but he ain't going to come in during the daylight.
Which in turn, by them going in and screwing it up, helps you on the back end
It
for
does.
the harsher areas that you're going to.
Yeah. So when I'm in Michigan on public land, if I don't have to use waders or hip boots or a canoe or a boat to access it, it's rare that I hunt it. I want to go to places that are very difficult to access to take 95% of my hunting competition out of the equation because that's where the bucks are pushed to. That's where all these guys that are doing their preseason scouting and then the early season hunting, that's where they're pushing those deer too, is back in those hard to access areas. And a lot of times you'll cross a river with a canoe or something or waders, and it's a deer utopia. There may be some heavy cover around the perimeter, of the river, which is typical. And then you get back in there and there's oaks and it opens up nice and there's still going to be brush and stuff, but it's just beautiful area or marsh grasses and some cattails, just beautiful areas for deer to get up and feel somewhat comfortable moving during daylight hours. And that's where I do all my rut phase locations are on public land or back in bedding areas. And once in a while, if my early season locations, when I go and speed tour them, if they don't pan out, if they don't look like they got the adequate buck activity there, I'll go in some bedding areas that I'm not going to hunt during the rut, some secondary bedding areas on public lands, and I'll do sparring sequences, and that's where 4 of those 5 early season bucks were taken as sparring sequences back in bedding areas, hard to access bedding areas during the first few days of the season. Did that make sense?
Oh yeah, no, that made a lot of sense. I was with you on all of it.
And when you're looking for a bedding area, the easiest way to identify a bedding area is pretend everybody's trying to kill you. If everybody hunting on this property is trying to kill you, where are the only places you may go and lay down and possibly feel comfortable getting up and moving during daylight hours? That kind of puts it in a nutshell because that's exactly how the deer think. Everybody's trying to kill them. They are going to the most secure places they can be. If they're going to get up and move during daylight hours, they're going to be in a secure area to do so. Mature bucks.
Yeah, one thing I want to ask about in a second is the rattling sequences that you use, because you're spot on with that. In terms of act like you're trying to be killed. And one thing that I've started noticing, a lot of people, I think, year to year, whenever they're going shed hunting, they put a lot of stock in the sheds they find and where they're finding them. Maybe they're nearby a bedding area, and the buck is potentially spending time in that area. But one thing that I found the other day, and then it made me start thinking about this a little bit more, was a deadhead to a very mature buck. He's if he hadn't been chewed on, he was probably close to 150-inch deer, which for my area doesn't happen hardly ever. And where he was located was kind of in that similar. We don't have the same style of habitat, but there's a creek and there's an island in between the creek, and it's just thick and nasty. Sunlight gets down to it all the time, and it very very dense with cover. And it was actually probably 95% of the way buried over, and I could just barely see the tips of his antlers. But he was laying there, and that's when he died on that island. He was bedded. I don't know if he died from a harsh cold season or what it was from, but that was the exact spot that he was bedded down whenever he died. And also with my drone research, the reason I was even walking in that area was because I was shed hunting, and I have seen a heavy amount of deer activity down in that area. And then now while I'm shed hunting, I find a skull to a buck that was bigger than 90% of the bucks I researched this season. So how have you found deadheads, and whenever you do you put much stock into them, and kind of the mentality of historical sign with mature bucks repeating themselves over a period of time?
Typically, when I find a deadhead, it's got a rib cage with it, and usually it's a roadkill or somebody shot it with a bow or a gun, and that's where it ended up going and dying. Um, I don't think I've ever found a deadhead where I assume the deer died from old age, but obviously, if you find a dead mature buck, uh, and he's in security cover or in a bedding area, that's where he feels secure. So that's going to be a spot. If I'm not already hunting in that location or area, that's a location I'm definitely going to consider putting up a location, setting up a location and marking it on Onyx and hunting it probably once or twice during the course of the season, because bucks die or bed where they feel secure. When a buck gets wounded, if he's shot in the liver or in the guts, they still have their mental capacities. When you shoot a deer in the lungs, they run full tilt 50 to 100 yards and fall on the ground. With Typically it's not down a runway; they just run. Okay, when you shoot a deer in the guts, especially in the guts because they live longer with a gut shot or a liver shot, they can live anywhere from, with a liver shot, they can live up to like 16, 18 hours, but they wouldn't die.
I've seen them live on a liver shot for 72 plus hours.
Wow.
That's from someone that tracks deer, and then after they die, I go in and I dissect them. On the liver shot deer, the longest I've seen one live, it was just over 3 days, and he relocated beds multiple times, and he wasn't even bumped throughout that. He was shot, and he circled around. One of the things, this is kind of interesting, and this is kind of taking a random
I
turn, but
want you to tell me where he was
yeah,
hit for two when you're done.
yeah. So whenever he was shot, and this goes across the board for mature bucks from what I've seen, whenever you shoot a mature buck, especially in the liver or the stomach, they always try to go home, whichever direction that is, and oftentimes it doesn't even make sense. Like
And they
they'll
have
make a
their mental capacities when they're doing it.
Yeah, they'll make a complete U shape in the terrain that makes no sense, and they're heading back to wherever their home is. So one, that's actually an educational perspective for you. If you shoot him and you start blood tracking him and he's heading back home, you know the general area that this mature buck was calling home at that point, which you can kind of log in your brain. I know that doesn't help you get your buck back, but in the end, it's kind of like, oh, okay, he was heading back home. But two, he ended up bedding down on his way back home. He wasn't able to make it back because he was feeling too bad, and I located him day one. And then day two, I came back and he had relocated 400 yards to the south on the edge of a field in a native grass field. He was just out in the open of a native, but it was thick, it was heavy, and it was you couldn't see it from a road. It was screen covered. There was no way you could see him where he was at. And I located him there on that field edge. And then I was like, okay, he's probably going to be there all day long. So I let him stay there all day long. And I came back in the evening to relocate him, and he was gone. Okay. So I came back the next morning and he had relocated like 700 yards back to what I would have called his core area at that time. And then from that core area, I think the only reason I could think he was getting up so much was maybe there were dogs that were bumping him around, whether it was coyotes or domestic dogs. There were a lot of domestic dogs in this area, but in the end, he actually died at what I would have called his core bedding area, his home. I think that he ended up making it home, and he got shoved in that direction by either domestic dogs or coyotes. And then after we dissected him, it was a frontal quartered two shot, very sharp frontal quarter two, and they nicked a single lung. They pile drive through the liver, and I think they poked just out the other side of the liver and barely nicked the stomach, just enough so there was a little bit of internals from the stomach coming out. But they nicked the lung, pile drive the liver, poked out on the other side, and nicked the stomach. And he lived for over 3 days.
Wow, that shocks me. That the arrow physically went through this pretty much the center of the liver, and he's that long.
Yeah, and the interesting thing
Wow.
about that one as well is these hunters, they backed out. They didn't go in and they weren't trudging up the woods. But in a lot of cases, when you do that, you're with the mentality he's going to go off, he's going to bed down, he's going to stay there, he's going to die, which happens in most instances. But in this particular instance, and I think it was caused because if there weren't coyotes or domestic dogs, I think he would have probably stayed in that first spot. But there's no way they would have ever found him. I mean, there's a 100% chance they would not have found him. He moved so far from where he was so far from removed from where he was heading. It was really cool. So
Yeah, I was gonna say he had to be pushed because usually with a liver shot they get sick and they'll bed down as long as they're not bothered. That's where they will eventually die. You know, that wow, the longest I've seen one live with a liver shot's 18 hours, and it was not dead. And it was not dead when we found it. If we had to kill it, it was still alive, but it
yeah,
couldn't
that's
get.
actually a really similar time frame for one of my friends shot a buck, and it was a broadside liver shot where he just passed just straight through full liver, and on that one he lived for around that 16 to 20. Maybe it was. Let me think. He shot in the morning. We found him. Yeah, it was close to 16 hours. And whenever we walked up on him, then we could see him. His body was still heaving and breathing. He was just barely alive, but he didn't have enough life in him to even lift his head. So we went ahead and finished him off, and that was the end of it.
My theory on liver shots is, the front of the liver has all the big arteries going into it. So if you shoot them in the front of the liver, up by the diaphragm, up the front of the diaphragm, they die relatively fast. Usually 2 to 4 hours max. But if you shoot them back through the liver where the veins are really small, they live longer, which only makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, no,
The
that
bigger,
makes a lot of
the
sense.
bigger the arteries, the quicker they're going to bleed out. And a gut shot, they can live for a long time with a gut shot too.
How long do you see him live on a single lung shot?
Oh, I've killed 3 bucks that had scarred over single lungs from arrows, so they never died.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. It's a very common thing right now with kind of going back to the arrows topic that I was mentioning with a lot of guys shooting really fast bows with really light arrows and really large mechanicals. This combination for maximum resistance of the arrow on impact, they're not getting a lot of penetration, and I see a lot of single lung hits taking place. And very much a ton of confusion as to why that deer didn't die. It's just we maybe deflected off of a scapula or a rib or something, but you went right into the pump house. Why is the deer not dead? And it's like, well, you only hit one lung, and they can live off one lung. And
I got
very
two,
oftentimes a mature buck will live off of one lung.
just like we can, just like humans can. If they bed down in a way that the blood from the hit lung is not draining into the other lung where they're going to drown. Obviously, if the blood from the hit lung runs into the good lung, they'll drown because now both are ineffective. But if they bed down in a manner that the blood will coagulate, and it's not going to affect the good lung, yeah, they can live. I've shot 3 bucks scarred over lungs. One was minimum of a 2-year-old scar, and it was, see, whoever hit that one had hit it on the right side of his shoulder, just below the spine, clipped through the top of the lung, and then if the chisel tip was actually sticking out of his hide in his shoulder, when I was gutting it, and that's how I found it. And I took the chisel tip off, and it was totally capsulated in cartilage, and the lung was healed for I don't know how many years that had been there like that.
What's the furthest a buck has ran on you, mature buck, whenever you shot him? Where he didn't have to be mature, I suppose. Where you did hit him in the pump house, double lung, maybe heart. What's the furthest one's ever ran on you?
A little over 200 yards with a double broadside long shot, 200 yards, and it was because of the broadhead. I was shooting a mechanical that this guy talked me into trying. Uh, I think it was 2008. I can't remember the name of the broadhead, but it was a mechanical, and the mechanical, when it hit something hard, like the hide, the blades popped out. So they deployed from the rear, and then as soon as it went through the rib cage and into the vitals area, the internal body, there was enough pressure on the blades to push the blades back in, and the tip popped forward. So the tip actually was like a little plunger. So whenever it hit something, it would plunge the blades out, and there was enough, as long as there was enough force on the tip, it kept those blades popped out so they would cut. As soon as there was no force on the tip, when it got into the body cavity, the blades went back in because there wasn't much force going through the lungs on that tip, but there was more force on the blades to push them back in, still going through the rib cage. And then as soon as it hit the rib cage on the opposite side, for the exit, it was enough pressure on the tip to deploy the blades and then go back through and leave a pretty decent sized entry and exit wound. But when I actually looked at the lungs, because I was shocked with a perfect hit, this deer went 200 yards. I pulled the lungs out, and it was like a field tip went the lungs. That deer went 200 yards.
Yeah, the furthest I've had one run was this buck here, and we had him jawbone aged because he came out of nowhere. I don't know where, but he just had really have gnarly-ish ugly rack and weird throwing some weird stuff off of him, and his body was giant. His legs, I remember, were just huge coming off of the front of him, and I shot him from 30 yards with a mechanical. It was like an inch and a half or 2 inch cut mechanical. I don't know what it was. I was a little bit newer into archery. I was younger, and he was quartered away slightly, and I hit through the middle of his lung that was facing me, the top of his heart. The blade sliced through the top of his heart, and then it sliced through the bottom of his opposing lung, and it was a full pass through. And that deer ran a little over 300 yards. But a lot of his run that he did was downhill, and I think that kind of helped him get down to the bottom where he
Yeah,
was going.
yeah.
Because once he hit the bottom, he kind of bottomed out, and that's where we found him, and he was dead. But still, he ran just over 300 yards with both lungs being hit and the top of his heart, and it was like this is pretty impressive. So yeah, mature
Yeah,
bucks are,
that's a
they're
long
pretty.
way.
Yeah, they're pretty strong animals. So a single lung, moral of the story, is not going to kill them
And
in most cases.
the bigger the body, the more blood they have, and the longer it takes for them to bleed out and die. And plus they're covering more ground with each lope. So, hey, one other thing I wanted to kind of touch on, we didn't when we were talking about hill country. A lot of times on all day sits, you need to also move. Like in the morning, the thermals are coming up, and in the evenings, the thermals are going down. So in the evenings, there's going to be thermal hubs down in the bottoms where you want to move down if you have a good scent control regiment, that is, down to that bottom because bucks can actually cruise the valleys and smell anything that had been up going along the ridge because the thermals are going downward. and in the morning you'd want to hunt more at the top. That's where the bucks are going to cruise and bed down because the thermals are going up in the morning as it's warming up.
Yeah, no, that's, and the important part about that is that you're capable of going to the bottom
Right.
because
Yeah.
of your scent
Now,
control regimen. Yeah, no, 99% of guys that attempt that, going to the bottom and hunting bottoms, I mean, unless you truly have a long valley and you can utilize a very steady wind to blow it in a certain direction, and you know the deer are coming from the side, not downwind of you, then it's almost impossible to hunt down in bottoms because you're just getting consistent swirling. And so yeah, the only way that you can ever implement that, and even that was one thing I was going to mention about the deadhead that I found on that perfect bedding location where I've seen a lot of deer activity. I'll never mention where it's at. It's a great spot, and I'll never hunt it. I promise. It is impossible to hunt. There's no way that you could hunt it unless you found a way to be scent free. Whether you did your regimen or you built a little box and you used 40 silicone, tubes on it, and you silicone the absolute heck out of that thing, and then you went, you sat in it, you slept in it that night, you woke up, and maybe you even like piped a vent 30 foot in the sky for your scent to blow out in the thermals or something. There's no way that you could go down there unless you were truly scent free.
yeah, but then
And
you have the
that's
silicone odor.
oh yeah, that's okay.
Silicone
Well, that,
odor.
yeah. Well, you let it sit there for. So I built the tower. Whenever I was to answer the silicone odor thing, I built the tower whenever I was 21, 22. I was in college, and I had a creek bottom that I wanted to hunt, and we had a food plot down there that I had planted, and it did fine. Whatever, good job, food plots. And really, the food plot wasn't why the deer were moving through there. They're moving through there because this was just a phenomenal spot, and I had a way to access it from a creek bed from behind. So I would walk all the way up the creek bed, making all the noise in the world, and get in the tower. And I would get there 2 to 2.5 hours before sun up, and then I could sit in that tower all day long, and I could have a doe standing or buck, a younger buck. If I seen a mature buck, they got shot. But I could have a doe or a younger buck standing within 10 yards of my tower at any time, and they wouldn't have a clue. They never be able to smell me, nothing. And that was because I built and I've sat in some manufactured towers that claim to be scent proof, and I have not had the same success personally. I've tried them in this same scenario at an agriculture property where a guy had one, and it ended up blowing the deer out. But in this particular tower that I built, where I genuinely did use like 40 tubes of caulking and a bunch of other stuff to seal, I sealed the absolute heck out of that thing, especially the windows. That was the hardest thing to figure out. But anyways, yeah, I didn't know how to go odorless. I wasn't John here, so I defeated it with technology, and I built something, and it worked. It really did, until there was a 13-inch rain that came in and it blew it down the creek and destroyed it. So, yeah, we don't have that tower anymore. I wish I did, because I would do some research with it, but it is gone now. It is by the wayside. Yeah,
Well, build
completely
another one.
destroyed.
Build another one.
Yeah, it took a lot of time to build. I put a lot of money into it too. Actually,
Well,
I was poor because I was a college student. I scavenged so many pieces and parts and pieces of fabric and rubber plate, like all sorts of randomness to build that tower. So in the end, I think I spent $300 total, and most of that was on the silicone. So
wow.
yeah, yeah,
Wow.
because I also worked at a school at the time, and I was taking pieces of metal and any spare plywood that was used for projects. I took I DIY built that thing pretty hardcore. So yeah, it's pretty neat.
By the way, when you were talking about yeah, guys without a scent control couldn't hunt those thermal hubs in the valleys. That's what I was mentioning when prior to 1996, I had quit hunting places like that in the early 80s. I just got busted all the time, so I just
Yeah,
quit. I just quit even hunting those places. But now, yeah, I can hunt anywhere. But
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. That's cool.
are you hunting out of a saddle now? Not the
Yes, yeah, I am a saddle boy. I use a tethered, and I do not have the scent. So my backpack right there smells terrible in your world. But I would love to try to. I think I'm going to try some of these things that you've suggested, and in your book. I mean, you've laid it all out, and attempt some of this in a research perspective where you can scent lock yourself to the point that you are truly scentless, and then have wind blowing in the direction purposefully where a mature buck is located, and see if he can locate you. I mean, and I would garner to think there's obviously a lot of variables to set up on that research project, and this is me just spitballing right off the top of my head, but there are things that can be done with the thermal drone in conjunction with a human that is actually properly set up the way that John would set them up. Not setting up a jacket with pants and not wearing the head. Like you actually have to do everything fully through, and just see its effectiveness in field with a thermal drone in conjunction to it. And I bet it'd work just based off
If
talking
you
to
have
you. So.
if you have any hookups and when you're getting ready to do that, just let me know. But that chapter spells everything out in great detail. Talks about the fallacy of the dog tests and all that crap. And you could get in a totally odorless suit, a rubber suit that has no human odor on it whatsoever. And if you walk down a lane or down across a weed field or something and you let a dog go, even though there's no human odor, that dog is going to smell the ground disruption to where you went. So that is not an indication of, smelling the human. It's an indication of smelling the ground disruption. You know, I would dare anybody to, challenge me to any kind of a test, on a deer hunting scenario where, I'll sit someplace and they can film me with deer downwind. Because my son did it in Germany, people that didn't believe him, and they actually went out and did tests and filmed them. I don't know where the films went. My son died of cancer. But they did it. A TV show went out and filmed it and uh, passed with flying colors. And both with wild boars and roe deer. Roe deer, they don't have whitetails in Germany, but with roe deer and wild boars. Boars have great noses.
Well, and to be able to just go and live inside of their bedding areas in these low-lying,
Oh,
tucked-up
big
places.
time.
I mean, there's no way that you can do that unless you're scent free. There's
Absolutely.
absolutely no way that you can perform your hunting style without that.
When you're hunting in a bedding area on an all-day set during rut phases, deer can come from any freaking direction. There's no rhyme nor reason. If they're pushing does around and stuff or searching for does, they'll go by you on uncharted routes. So you can play the wind the best you think you know how, but during an all-day sit in a bedding area, you're gonna have deer downwind of you. Period.
And how important, that was one thing I was trying to remember earlier, and I finally remembered it, is your rattling sequences to you, because it seems like a lot of times whenever you're actually getting a buck killed, it's prefaced by a rattling sequence of some kind. So what kind of goes through your brain in terms of when you start implementing that tactic? And then you also mentioned before that you're kind of doing like a light sparring session versus something else.
Anything I do sparring or rattling, it's labeled rattling, but it's sparring to me. Uh, in Michigan, I spar. Spar as soon as bucks get hard antlered. Usually bucks here, the bigger bucks by September 15th or September 5th, they're usually rubbed out. They're hard antlered. And as soon as bucks are hard antlered, they immediately start sparring for pecking order. And that's a social activity. They're not in an all-out brawl for breeding rights. They're just sparring for pecking order within their core area. And they continue to spar all the way up until pre-rut when the first estrus does when those start coming into estrus, then they physically fight for breeding rights. So sparring sequences are just tickling I use a bag with wooden sticks. I'd never use plastic, and they got 11-inch sticks. And sparring sequences are just little tickling time, like bucks. They'll you can have a 10 point with a 6 point, and they'll just get up to each other and they'll push their antlers together and they'll click them together until they kind of match, and then they just push each other for dominance. I'm sure you've seen that.
Oh, yeah, no, I was gonna say probably it's hard. I throw percentages on things a lot without like having the true data in front of me, but well over 90% of the time whenever I see buck, probably well over 95% of the time when I see bucks sparring or fighting, um, they're doing just that. It's kind of, it almost looks like they're play fighting. They're just kind of rubbing antlers together and halfway shoving each other around. They're not trying to kill one another. They're just kind of, they're messing about. And in the end, one of them will clearly walk away as, that this buck's obviously stronger than the other one, but I think that they realize that going into it. They're sparring around together. And rarely do you find two mature bucks that break down and they actually clash. It happens, but it's nowhere near as frequent as people think. Yeah, whenever that happens, it happens one time for those 2 bucks, and maybe they'll come back and they might have another connection every once in a while, but very seldom. And even if they do come back and have that connection, one thing I've seen, I didn't record these 2 bucks fighting against each other in the past, but I had 2 mature bucks. One was just he's one of the first bucks I did a video on. I named him Winner. I know we've already talked about deer naming in private. It's acceptable for me to name deer for research. It's okay.
Oh, you're
He
doing
was,
research,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Okay, we'll stop. But he was a beautiful mainframe 10, and there was another buck that was a 6x5, and he was big bodied, much stronger looking deer than the big 10. And the 10 also had a really really bad limp on his left hand foot, terrible, like it looked like he had a knife just jabbed in the bottom of it. He could never take a step on it without just lifting off of it immediately. And he traveled over a mile almost every single day, that deer did, the one that had the wounded foot. Almost every day he was a lunatic. He would go everywhere. He never bacheled it up with a group of bucks. He hated other bucks, and he was just this really aggressive deer constantly. And one time, the 6x5 overlapped into the 10's home range, and they met each other. And whenever they met each other, there was a group of other bucks kind of nearby him, younger bucks separating the two, and the 10, who didn't like other bucks, lowered his head and walked a straight line right through all these other bucks, and he pinned his ears back, and all the other bucks just kind of bounced off of him. It was kind of like big fish swimming through smaller fish. But at the end of it, I saw the 6x5, and I was like, oh gosh, they're gonna meet, and 6x5 is not going to deal with this because he's a giant body deer in comparison to the 10. He was bigger deer, and he was healthier. And whenever the 10 made it up to him, he tucked his tail and bounced around him just like all the other deer. And I watched that and was kind of like, what just took place? Because there's no way the 6x5 couldn't have just beaten up the 10. But evidently, everyone realized the pecking order in the hierarchy in that, and that the 10 was the dude. He was the psychopath. He was the UFC
He was
fighter that's
Mike
just gonna,
Tyson.
yeah, no, he's just gonna throw you on the ground and destroy you and try to kill you. There was no place sparring with that deer. We will fight to the death every single time. That's kind of the way that I walked away from it, was because in my brain, seeing those two stand next to each other, there's no way that other buck couldn't have beat him in a fight. But he saw him and realized who he was, and he's like, absolutely not even with a broken foot. I'm not dealing with you. I'm backing out. So yeah.
Some bucks are just more aggressive, just like people. Some people are more aggressive than others, and a buck, I'm sure they've sparred in the past, and he doesn't want anything to do with that aggressive deer. Deer.
So you said earlier that you had, unless we have more deer topics, which I guess my drone stuff is deer topics, but you said that you had questions related to the drone.
Well, you've actually answered a few of them, but back to the sparring thing. When I do sparring, I'll spar. I'll make sparring sequences all through the season. Our season opens October 1, so I'll do sparring sequences right up until the rut phases, and even during the rut in Michigan, it's pretty rare that I do an aggressive rattle sequence because we usually don't have, where I hunt anyway, I'm not on managed stuff. We usually don't have two big dominant bucks in the same zone area. So you don't ever get to hear that hard rattling like you see the dudes on TV where there's 20 of them, just bang and clash the antlers. That doesn't exist. That spooks deer where I live because they're not used to hearing that. So I always do sparring sequences. I'll get them a little louder maybe during the rut phases, but they're usually sequences where I'll tickle the antlers to tickle the sticks together for 10 or 15 seconds. Then I'll have 10 15 seconds of silence, then I'll do it again for 10 seconds, and then another 10 or 15 seconds of silence, and then one more at the end where I'll make the clicking noise, and then I stop. And then I'll usually 5 minutes later, if I haven't got a reaction, I'll do one more sequence. I gap it about 5 minutes apart, and I'll do them in the mornings or late in the evenings. And if I don't get a response, then I just let my location work on the merits I chose it for. But if you're in areas where you're in an area with adequate security cover, you know, early season, mid season, October lull, I don't care. If you're in a bedding area and you are in there before daylight and beat any bucks in there, it's very common to be able to spar a buck out of just curiosity, if he hears two bucks sparring, to come over and see what it is. It's just a curiosity thing, and sparring is a very social activity to deer. And doing it on the edge of a standing cornfield is also something I've done successfully. A few years back, 2023, I think it was 2023, I sparred in 16 different bucks by October 15th in Michigan. Only one of them was a shooter, and I shot him. But I mean, I sparred in 16 bucks. As long as I'm in the right type of an area, you just don't do it anywhere. You have to be in the right type of area, and you have to do it at the right time of day.
And whenever you're doing it, you're 25 plus foot in the air in a saddle, right?
Yeah. Well, early season, I'll hunt lower. I'll hunt as low as 20 feet. Sometimes I've shot bucks at 12 feet off the ground, and I've shot bucks on the ground. But typically, by the time when the foliage starts to drop, yeah, I'm usually in trees that are I'm 25 feet to my feet. I want to be up out of their peripheral vision because there's no foliage in the trees, and it's too easy to pick. Cause deer here tend to look in trees for people when they're walking through the woods.
Well, I know some people kind of think that there's a little bit of a fear with rattling while elevated up in a tree because the thought that a deer can kind of sense the height at which, because they're so good at sensing exactly the exact true location as to where the sound came from. So they begin to worry about the height at which they're making the rattling sound. Can they decipher that? And in your experience, once you're 25 plus foot off, off the ground, then no.
And they're far enough away that they can't pinpoint me up in the tree. They pinpoint the location. There was one time, it was October 2nd, 1999. I can actually remember the year. And I was in a bedding area, and there was some oaks. There were some scattered oaks in this bedding area. And about a half hour after daylight, I could see the legs of two deer walking deeper into the bedding area, going through the bedding area. And they were probably 80 yards away. And this was October 2nd, so there's still foliage. I couldn't tell what they were. I could just see the legs of two deer. They looked like two mature deer, big deer. So took out my rattle bag and I did a quick sparring sequence, and I made it short because they were like 80, 100 yards away. And they stopped and they started walking towards me. And when they got about 40 yards away from me, there was an oak there, and they started eating acorns underneath this oak. And they were both bucks. It was an 8 and a 10 point. And so now I want to do another sparring sequence because they started ate acorns for a few minutes, and then they started walking back in the direction they were headed at first. They'd lost interest in my sparring sequence. So now I'm trying to get their attention again, and now I know I can't do a sparring sequence because I'm 25 feet up in the air and they'll pick me because they can see me because I can see them. So I pulled out my inhale grunt because I carry an inhale and an exhale grunt call depending on how far I want the noise to carry. I pulled out my inhale grunt and turned around backwards in my saddle and did a real soft inhale grunt, kind of like turkey hunting where you do it soft where they think you're farther away so they go past you. And that's exactly what they did. The 8 and the 10 came and walked right within 5 yards of the tree, and I shot the 10 point just with that little short, real short, one time grunt on an in.
Yeah, I've seldom been very effective myself with a grunt, but that's probably a personal experience
Oh,
of being inefficient.
well, I already had their interest with the
Yeah,
sparring sequence. That's why they
yeah,
came. It's extremely rare that I cold grunt. I'll cold,
yeah.
I'll cold spar all the time.
Mm.
Very frequently mornings and evenings. But as far as just cold grunting, I've had very little success grunting. It is interesting because I've talked to a lot of guys that have. I just
That have
haven't.
had success with grunting.
Yeah, they say they have anyway, but then I'm also thinking, what are you trying to grunt in? If you're grunting in a year and a half or 2.5 year olds, those bucks are susceptible to a lot of tactics that a 3.5 year old that I want to kill is not. So, everything boils down to what are you trying to kill? I'll do stuff and say you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, pee out of the tree, whatever. And people are like, well, I pee out of trees and I've shot, I shoot bucks every year. Well, what are you trying to kill? If you're trying to kill a 1.5 or 2.5 year old deer or does, yeah. When you step up into a 3.5 year old and older bucks in a pressured area, you're hunting a different animal. They are a lot smarter. They don't fall for that stuff. Yeah, if you're making a mock scrape, you can pee in them. You could pee and make a mock scrape because there's not going to be any deer probably come and take on that scrape. for multiple hours. So that urine is going to end up smelling just like basically raw ammonia almost. You know, it's going to a lot of its human odor after a while. But if you pee out of your tree and a half an hour later a buck comes by and it's downwind of you and he smells that urine, deer urine and human urine do not smell the same, and I don't care what anybody says. And yeah, don't pee out of your tree if you're after mature bucks. I mean, why would you pee out of a tree in the first place? And I had a guy call me and he asked me scent control questions 2 different times for almost an hour each. Then the third time he called me during seasoning. He's like, I'm still getting winded and I'm using scent lock and doing everything right. And I ran through the process and everything was right. I'm like, God, I don't understand. And he said, oh, but does it matter if I pee out of the tree? I went quiet for like 15 seconds. I said, you're not freaking serious, are you? And he said, yeah, he was an Amish guy and he lived in Iowa. And I said, of course you can't pee out of a tree if you're after mature bucks. If you're after little bucks, yeah, you might get away with it. I said, how often do you do it? He said, you know, I stay hydrated. I'm an Amish guy and I drink a lot of water. And I usually, as soon as I get in my stand, I pee out of the tree. I said, you know what? Don't ever call me again. I was pissed. Why would you do it? Take a bottle and pee in a bottle, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
You know, don't even put it down there as being a thought that something could go wrong.
Yeah, I generally choose to try to not eat any food or drink any water. That's kind of my thing. It's like how long can you go
Yes.
while fasted? Especially if I'm hunting in the evening specifically, and I have like a whole day to prepare for what I was about to do. Then yeah, you just shut off eating at a certain period and drink all the water you can. Go to the bathroom. Don't pack anything with you, and just don't eat snacks while you're out eating while you're out hunting. It's
I do the same exact thing. I don't drink coffee in the morning because I love
oh
coffee.
gosh,
I
yeah.
don't drink coffee because it makes me want to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, and sometimes I drink coffee to purposely go to the bathroom before I. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyways, yeah. There's a lot of strategies. Learn your body, people, so that way you can empty your everything before you go hunting. That way you don't have mishaps.
I can actually go number two in the tree in a bag. So
Okay.
out of
Now
my.
that takes some skill. And a saddle. You can do that in a saddle.
Oh yeah, I just pull the saddle down underneath my knees, and I have gallon and a half Ziploc bags, and I go in that, and then I zip it up and pull the saddle back up under my butt.
So in order to hunt like John, you have to become a borderline psychopath. Essentially,
Yeah,
just
I.
yeah,
You ever heard of Mark Kenyon?
yeah, oh yeah.
I did a podcast with him, and I told him that, and he came unglued. He couldn't handle it. He said, that's the strangest thing I've ever heard anybody do.
Says the guy that killed a lot of bucks and has how many Pope and Youngs on your wall? Yeah, I mean carry Ziploc bags around people. It'll help you. I guess it's not going to help you if you don't implement the scent regimen. You're just doing
Yeah,
you're wasting your time if you're carrying around a Ziploc bag. Okay, we can move on from that.
yeah, but I'm just saying it. You can do that with a saddle.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'll make a video on it someday.
You know what? What you do is so interesting to me. The whole drone thing, being able to research what deer are actually doing out there is kind of really interesting to me. I thought I've watched a few of your videos and I was very very impressed.
No, I mean, it's definitely been met with a good amount of controversy, which it probably should. But a lot of people, whenever they initially click on things, or maybe the way the thumbnail is designed or something, it's as if, like utilizing this information purely as to hunt these deer or something of that nature. Oh, you'll never, keep that information to yourself and not go hunt the deer or tell your family or this, that, and the other. And it's like, come on guys, like a little bit of self-control, it can manage that. Now there were times my first year whenever I was flying and nobody knew that I was flying the drone, where I had seen one of the things that kind of gets me going is like a good semi-massy 120-inch mainframe 8 that's mature, and he's a prick. Whenever I see a deer like that, I get very excited and I want to hunt him. And I had one of those bucks that I researched that first year.
Define
It's like,
prick.
man, what?
Define the word
Define.
prick.
Yeah, similar to that 10 that I was telling the story about earlier. He's mean to everything. So in the early season, whenever I was studying him, he would he would stand up out of his bed, and he was immediately, even in velvet, he was immediately establishing dominance with every other deer in the area. He would walk up on younger deer and he would stomp right next to them in their bed and get them on their feet. He would be walking along, and does would step within a couple foot in front of him, and he would kind of lower his head, or he would stomp his foot in their direction, and just kind of, he was just mean to everything around him. And there are bucks that I find that are mature and dominant in inherently, just visually, that are nothing like that. They just seem like kind of pillowy sweethearts in comparison to that deer, or in comparison to the 10. They don't tolerate anything walking within their bubble. And not only do they not tolerate anything walking within their bubble, but they seek out confrontation very consistently. They will walk, like I said, they'll walk up to the beds of other deer, and they will get them up on their feet, and they're just constantly mean to them. And one fascinating thing about that buck, actually, I don't know where I was supposed to go with this conversation, but was that he was extremely mean, and I rarely ever saw him get within, hit striking distance of another deer. But one time, it was in peak rut, a younger buck came up to him. He was a little forked horn, year and a half old, and he walked up to him while he was in his bed. And the year and a half old was kind of trying to spar with him while he was bedded, and he
Mm-hmm.
would lower his head, and he was halfway playing with him, but he wasn't. He was trying he was trying to sleep. This is peak rut. Like, there are does and estrus. He stopped down for like a 30-minute nap, and this year and a half old buck is kind of trying to play with him and spar with him, and he was taking it. He was laying there, and he was letting this young buck just fight him while he was bedded. And after 5 minutes of it, he stood up out of his bed, and they proceeded to clean one another for 20 to 30 minutes apiece.
Wow.
And I just sat there and watched it and was like, what in the world? Like, is that a brother, an old, maybe someone that he's but I'd never seen him be nice to another deer that entire season. And all of a sudden this young buck comes in, and it was just like a long lost family member he's best friends with. He loved him. He was never rude to that deer in that moment in time. I actually hadn't seen them together again after that event took place, but during that event I just peak rut, very interesting. And he tolerated him fighting him, and then they stood up with one another, and they cleaned one another, which
Did
was
you
very
have
interesting.
any drone of what that big of the 8 point was doing prior to bedding down? Like he was wore out and he didn't want to be a conservative?
Yes, that was actually on a day that was it was a midday wind shift that had occurred, and actually I think it was the first time I'd ever recorded a midday wind shift. And he had been traveling really far that morning. He traveled over a mile and a half that morning, which I think he was moving at around 1,000 yards per hour, which in um, the deer research world is pretty fast. And he made it to his bedding location, which was off the south-facing slope of a thermal hub. I've told the story quite a few times, but you haven't heard it. So, off the south-facing slope of a thermal hub, and the wind was coming out of the south at that time, so he was technically bedded on the windward side of this ridge, but it was only 2 to 3, 4 mile per hour winds, not too variable, and he bedded down there for an hour and a half or 2 hours, and then the wind started shifting to the west, and almost as soon as it hit to the west, it was 7 miles per hour at that point, 7 to 10. He stood up, and the wind shifted completely to the north within 45 minutes from the time that it hit west. And whenever it was a straight north wind, it was a big cold front moving in. Whenever it was a straight north wind, it was 15 to 20 miles per hour at that time. And he had already been standing up and kind of halfway moving around, and other deer were also shifting with him. And he relocated completely. He moved around 3/4 of a mile to a half mile from that bedding location to another location and bedded back down. And while he was bedded in that second location, after he had been shifted from the wind, was whenever that younger buck moved in on him. And then that's whenever he started sparring with him, playing with him, and then they stood up and cleaned each other, and he moved on with his evening route that day. And one theory, actually, I'd said this in the Dan Infalt podcast, but it's a really interesting idea. It's one that I wanted to ask you about, that you'd think is, I'm really interested in deer intelligence and their reasoning capabilities, and how far out they're capable of thinking, their plans out for the future of that day or the next day and things like that. And, like, for reference, one deer I recorded here recently, he before a winter storm came moving in and wiped southern America, and it was basically a blizzard for our area. Massive cold front came in, and the day before this buck, he had, for weeks actually prior, he'd been moving around a quarter mile to a half mile every single day, very consistently. And this is late January or early February, and um, then the storm was coming in. So the day before the storm, he moved 1.6 miles, and he was constantly up on his feet browsing. So that tells me he was capable of sensing barometric pressure. One, so maybe that was just an instinctual thing. He was capable of recognizing the barometric pressure, so he stood up and he prepared for the storm that was coming in. Or maybe there's something mental to that where he recognized it as well. That like, okay, there's barometric pressure is dropping, rising, whatever, and there's a storm coming, so I need to prepare for it. So he goes out and prepare for it. So whether or not that's instinctual or that's him actually like planning for the storm that's to come, I don't really know. But the bedding story, he was bedded in an area that was a windward ridge, correct? Which is not common. Everyone likes to say they're bedded on the leeward side of the ridge, which I have not seen a lot of. It's kind of evenly split across the board. So he was on the windward side of the ridge with a really subtle south wind, and the wind shifted all the way to a north facing wind, which was 15 miles per hour, which in turn would have positioned him perfectly where he was bedded already. He didn't need to move. Why did he move? He was on the leeward side of this ridge in the bottom of a thermal hub, which to me, when I'm looking at it on a map, that's where he should be bedded. But he gets up and he completely relocates. And I think the reason, I've seen this multiple times now, so it took me quite a few times of seeing this activity take place to reason as to what I think happened. I think that he got up because he knew where he wanted to be that evening. He knew the location he was moving to that evening, and now these new conditions didn't work for that particular wind that was this new strong wind that's coming in, this really strong 15 mile per hour prevailing wind that's moving in. That's not going to work for where I want to be. So I have to move, completely relocate locations for this new evening location that I want to go to. And that's what was shifting him, not because he wanted to shift for a new bed, so for higher bedding security based off of wind direction. He was relocating based off of where he wanted to be that evening in a few hours, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So is there a question there, or you're just telling me?
Not really. Yeah,
Hey,
it's more so like
that's it.
yeah, think
That's
on that.
that's interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, it's all just, but I have observed it a lot. It's only a theory that nothing's factual on it, but I've seen it a lot where bucks will be bedded in a poor location, dependent upon wind direction and things like that, which it's always, in the end, if you actually pay attention to it a little bit more, it's still a good bedding location, but it's not a traditional bedding location. It's not that picturesque leeward side of the ridge with the habitat edge and things like that. It's, he's on the windward side, and like for one time I recorded a buck. He was bedded on the windward side of a ridge with 25 to 30 mile per hour winds, and it was sleeting ice that day. And yes, I can fly my drone on ice. And he was bedded facing the storm, getting pounded with ice, and his face and his antlers. He had his head down, and his antlers were just getting caked in ice while he's laying there. And it's like, what are you doing? So I don't know if in that setting he stopped there because he was too tired and he couldn't make it to where he wanted to go. But then I've seen it multiple other times where deer are positioned in a poor location, dependent upon the storm that's moving in, and they're on the windward side of the ridge facing the storm. I've seen a lot of weird things, and nothing has really added up. There's not been one thing that occurs significantly more than another to say, yeah, they always do that. They always do that. So it's very random across the board, and it's very hard to come out with an answer in the end as to like, yeah, they absolutely 100% of the time bet on the leeward side of the ridge. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I personally feel like deer definitely have a thought process. They have the capability of thinking ahead. I would definitely think with storms coming in, that's pretty common. With barometric pressure changing, they know a storm's coming in, so they get up and feed. Same way as when a storm goes through, they go on a feed if the storm's been happening for a while. And I know they have thought process because if you spook a deer, a mature buck at a location, your eye, if he picks you in a tree, or even a mature doe, if she picks you in a tree for the rest of the season, your odds on in a pressured area. I always have to say that in a pressured area because on TV crap anything could happen. But in a pressured area, if a deer picks you, or in the old days wins you in a specific tree location or a specific location, your odds of having an opportunity at that deer at that location the rest of that season are pretty close to zero. So they have the thought process to avoid that location during daylight hours or be very cautious and look in that tree where they picked you when they come in to make sure you are not there. They have that type of a memory and that type of a thought process. I think I told you the story about that guy that had that big mature doe on public land coming in December, and he wanted her dead because there was also an 8 point buck that was still left. So they didn't. There was an 8 point buck that didn't get shot during the gun season, and he knew. And this was back when baiting was legal in the '90s or early '90s, might even have been the late '80s. And he wanted to try and get a shot at this 8 point, but this buck and two fawns kept coming into his bait pile before dark, and the doe would hang up right on the edge of the bedding area and not step out to the sugar beets because she could see him in the tree. He was It was a huge oak. He had a tree stand facing the bait pile. The swamp was the other side of the bait pile, and she would come in. The two fawns would run over to the bait pile, start eating, and she would stand there and she'd see him in the tree, even though he was trying to wear camo that blended in with the background of the oak. She'd see him, and then she would start snorting, and of course the foliage is down and snow on the ground, and any deer within a half a mile can hear this doe snorting, so nobody's going to come out to that. That 8 point definitely ain't going to come out during daylight to that bait pile. And this is before cameras. So I said, "You want me to kill that doe?" And he said, "What makes you think if I can't kill that doe, you can kill that doe?" And I said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "You want me to kill that doe?" And this is before Scentlock, okay? But I was hunting out of a saddle at the time. And he said, "You hunt out of that sling thing, right?" Because at the time that was called a tree sling, not a saddle. And I said, "Yeah." And he thought about it, and he was a good hunter. He shot a lot of deer, a lot of year and a half old bucks. He said, "Yeah, I'll give you a shot. Yeah, I want that doe out of there. I don't care who kills her. I just want her out of there." So we went over the next day, and he took me to that tree, and I climbed up to his stand in the tree, and then I went around steps, put steps up about 8 feet above his tree stand, and I was on the back side of the tree. So I've got the actual trunk of the tree between me and where the deer are coming from. And I waited for the correct wind to hunt it. The wind had to be from the swamp to the tree. And I hunted there, and exactly like he said, about half hour, 40 minutes before dark, I could see this doe and two fawns coming through the swamp, coming right towards the bait pile. Doe, two fawns came out. They're both button bucks. They came out and started feeding on sugar beets, and she just stood there, right on the edge. Didn't break her nose out of the edge of the cover, and she's staring at that tree. She'd look over that way, and then look back at that tree, and he wasn't there. So the stand is empty. I'm just peeking, barely peeking around the corner of the tree, the side of the tree. And after about 5 minutes, the fawns are gorging themselves, and she wants to eat because probably the 3 days prior she was there because nobody had been hunting there. And finally, she came out, and when she fed on the beets, she was facing the tree. So if anything would have been in that stand and made a move, she'd have caught it out of her peripheral vision. Because when she's down, her eyes still have that upward vision on her peripheral. And so she fed for a couple minutes, and finally she got comfortable, and she turned a little bit. So now she's quartering to me, and I waited until she put her head back down, quartering to me, and I just swung around with my saddle or sling and shot her, and that was that. And he was pretty impressed with that. That was kind of cool. That was one thing where the saddle definitely outbeat a tree stand.
One question I do generally want to start asking everybody at the beginning of the podcast, which I asked Dan at the beginning, I forgot to ask you because I was in a brain fog after I just got off a live stream with Luke McCauley from the University of Maryland. What is, in your opinion, the most difficult habitat to hunt? And that's we're going to say so long as hunting pressure is even across the board. We'll just say moderate hunting pressure across the board because a very, very important thing to continue to distinguish is that hunting pressure is like the number one thing that drives how you're going to hunt a
Right.
property, in my opinion, and in your opinion.
Absolutely. Totally.
And yeah, and so hunting pressure is even across the board. It's just medium. People have access to it. They hunt it from time to time. what is the most difficult form of habitat for you to hunt?
Flat timber. Flat timber. We've got like Manistee National Forest up in Michigan. It's hundreds of thousands of acres, and it's just relatively flat. Yeah, there's bedding areas here and there, but there's white oaks and red oaks and beech trees. And anytime you're hunting just open timber, it's hard to pick destination points because there's so many food trees. There's no rhyme or reason for them to be at any one of them the day you're there, if you know what I'm
Yeah.
saying. Deer tend to browse. They have larger core areas. Ag areas, usually a deer's core area is going to encompass, a square mile. I'm not saying a section, but 120 acres out of this section, for 300 out of that one, 30 out of that one. Uh, but big timber that's flat is very difficult. Big timber, like in Indiana, southern Ohio, southern Illinois, that's not as difficult to hunt as flat open timber because you have hills and ridges and saddles that change the terrain and give deer places they need to be. Like they like to move down the bottoms of the saddles. They don't like moving down the sides of steep ridges. It's harder for them to walk. They like eating on little flats that may be on the side of a ridge. There are a little bit more defined destination locations in hill country, but you've got to have a scent control regimen for that to work very well. But just flat open timber is, to me, the most difficult to hunt.
Yeah.
Or the same thing would be like if you're in Alabama or some of those southern states where you've just got big, huge, for miles and miles, swamps and stuff. That'd be the same thing. Basically, places where there's no defined destination locations.
Yeah.
That's places like that you have to put in a lot of time hunting to make kills.
Yeah.
You just got to spend a lot of time in trees and ag areas. Um, you don't have you just hunt smart. You just hunt certain areas of the ag where ag meets the timber or pinch points between feeding and bedding. It's a lot easier to pick destination locations.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. That's my favorite thing about hill country is that you can start analyzing these little micro terrain features that force travel routes, like cliffs and little edges that deer literally cannot travel. So therefore, you can just mark that off your list. Like, okay, well, you're not going to walk here, you're not going to walk here, and then you find where they're bedding and where they want to go, and okay, yeah, piece the puzzle together and find a way to hunt them. And if you're if you can be completely scent proof like John, then you can really get on top of them down the bottoms and their beds, which is pretty cool. So
Anybody can do that. It's not that difficult. It's not nearly as hard to be scent free as you think. It's not.
I was talking to one of my friends the other day about you and your scent regimen, and I'd mentioned it to him and how like I think it actually works. And I was telling him about it, and he looked at me and he's like, I don't have the patience for that. I was just like,
It
well,
doesn't require any.
evidently you're not serious enough.
It's just like anything. It just requires the learning curve to do it. Once you've got the process down, it's no more difficult than hunting with regular clothing. I have hundreds of people that send me emails on, God, I haven't paid attention to the wind in 10 years and I'm killing many more deer and seeing many more deer.
Oh
And it's
yeah, no,
not that
eliminating the wind out of anybody's hunting equation, I feel like would be that's like a mystical idea. That's just it's
night and
not
day,
even yeah,
night and day. Well,
yeah,
you can imagine
exactly.
hunting hill country. That's huge.
Oh yeah, no, it's like it's a massive ordeal, especially with thermals. And it just becomes like you can't hunt bottoms like we just talked about, or we talked about earlier with the dead skull deer, and the fact that you can and you can be scentless potentially. That's beyond game changing. It's not even oh my gosh, and I mean initially just off of that one thing that I already implemented this pre me with a drone, but I would implement it even heavier and be significantly more aggressive with it is in the morning time whenever bucks are out, like we talked about, you always getting into your stand 2 hours before light. I've always been a very big proponent of that, and especially if you're trying to access into a bedding area,
Right.
is finding
That's
ways,
a must.
and sometimes it's not possible from what I've seen, to be able to access that bedding area without spooking them where they're actually at. But if it's possible and you can find a way to get to that bedding location without them knowing you just walked into their bedding location, and be pre-set up with that. And so essentially, if you know where they like to feed, and you can get into their bedding location, this is non scent free derrick hunting here, and then having your scent blow away from where they were just feeding at. the mature buck is always the first one, in my experience, back to that bed, and you can pick him off whenever he's moving back into his bed. So sneaking back in 2 hours, 3 hours before light, and being set up in the bedding location, hanging out in the dark until shooting light comes up, and oftentimes he will be the first one back through his bed, and then you can kill him. But if you can do that, well, scent proof the entire time, then you don't have to wait for the perfect conditions. And sometimes the perfect conditions never come because he changes his feeding zone, he changes his feeding patterns, the time of season's changing constantly, or maybe the doe and estrus that he was tracking into that feeding area that you saw him at that one time is completely shifted now. So there's just so many variables to it, and being able to eliminate the wind from a hunting situation is just it's beyond a lot of people's reality mentally, probably. But it's pretty
I,
cool.
I like putting everything in a human perspective. And if I wanted to kill you, Derek, where would be my best place to hide to try and pick you off in my first hunt?
Probably my house. Yeah.
Probably in your house. Where would be the number one? Probably the number one spot would be in your bedroom. I'd break into your house, go up in your bedroom. I know you're going to be in the bedroom. You may come in the house and bypass the kitchen and just go right up and go to bed. Or, you've got maybe you got three doors into your house. If I station myself at one of your doors, I got a 33% chance. If I station myself in your bedroom, I've got a 100% chance killing you on my first set. So, and obviously some bedding areas are huge and some are small, but man, big bucks when they're in their core area and during the rut phases, when they push the estrus does, they force them into the bedding areas because that's where they feel comfortable breeding them all day. It's not like they breed them once during their estrus cycle. They'll breed them many, many times during their cycle, and every time they just don't walk over to the doe and she stands up and he breeds her, and then they both bed down right there, and he does it again 20 minutes later. They move around in the bedding area when they're doing those breeding processes.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot where a buck was just constantly shoving her around. And even there's a long period before he's actually able to ever breed her that takes place where he's just shoving her around constantly. And then once she actually enters estrus and she lets him come up behind him, lick her flank, all of the things that's about to take place, then even then she'll still just bounce constantly 50 yards this way, 50 yards this way, 50 yards
Yeah.
this way, just bouncing all over the place. And he's tracking right behind her that entire time. So yeah, no, I mean, being in their bedroom is by far the number one thing you can do.
And when they're bouncing around, it's on uncharted routes. It's not necessarily on runways.
In some cases, a mature buck, his bedroom can be a lot larger than my 10 foot by 10 foot bedroom as well. So sometimes he'll be in his bedroom and he's outside of range for you. But if he's bouncing around back inside of that area and he has a doe that he's constantly dogging down that entire time, then yeah, I mean, you're at some point you're opening up an opportunity to make a shot on him. But if you're not scent free, you're screwed. So you're not there's no way you're going to implement that strategy unless you just have a really strong variable wind and flatter terrain, things like that. But anyways, yeah, I think I've beaten that topic to death pretty hard, which it needed to be. So that was a good thing. So everybody, go out and order John's book and subscribe on him to YouTube, or subscribe on YouTube for him, so that way he can get past me in subscribers. Not that it matters, but
That's
because he
not going
should
to
be. Yeah,
happen.
it's not gonna happen. Yeah, there's gonna be like 4,000 people watch this and
No,
30
I
people.
just mean, I just mean you're just going to keep growing because you've got something that's very unique.
I appreciate it. But yeah, no, and any links that you're wanting to find related to John, his website, everything like that, it's going to be down in the description of the video or in the podcast notes, things like that. So, with that being said, thank you, John, for coming on, and I'm sure we'll have you on again in the future.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. Good luck out there, guys, this season. Coming up, got a ways to go, but it'll be here sooner than you think.
Well, right now it's time to get out in the woods and go scouting here pretty soon. So,
Yep, snow's finally melted here. I can see the ground outside.